Welcome to another video on stories of our history. The wind that howls across the Orkney Islands today is the same wind that filled the sails of the first Norse longships to breach these shores more than 12 centuries ago, a constant, salt-laden gale that has sculpted the treeless landscapes and the character of the people who live there. The archipelago, comprising roughly 70 islands of which 20 are inhabited, sits at the crossroads of the North Atlantic and the North Sea, a strategic fulcrum located precisely at 59 degrees north latitude, where the shortest sea routes between Scandinavia, the British Isles, Iceland, and the wider Atlantic world converge. To the ancient geographers, these islands were the Orkades, a name of uncertain origin but possibly derived from a pre-Celtic root meaning island of the wild boar, though the Vikings themselves reinterpreted it as Orkneyinga, the Seal Islands, a testament to the teeming marine life that sustained their settlements. The importance of Orkney's position cannot be overstated. A ship departing Bergen in Norway, sailing due west with the prevailing currents, would make landfall at Orkney in about 3 to 5 days, depending on the weather, and from there could strike south into the Irish Sea, north to Shetland and the Faroes, or west to the Hebrides and Iceland. Control of Orkney meant control of the maritime choke point through which all Norse traffic to the western colonies had to pass, a fact that early Norwegian kings understood with crystal clarity, and that the Jarls who ruled Orkney would exploit to build a power base that rivaled, and often threatened, the authority of the crown itself. The geographical centrality of the islands made them the keystone of the Viking North Atlantic, and over the course of 4 centuries, from the late 8th century to the early 13th, Orkney would evolve from a scattered collection of Pictish farming communities, living in the shadow of Neolithic monuments already thousands of years old, into the nerve center of an autonomous Norse earldom whose influence stretched across 1,000 miles of ocean. The first recorded Viking presence in Orkney is chronicled in the Irish Annals and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which note that in the year 794, the heathens laid waste the islands of Britain. And archaeological evidence from sites like the Brough of Birsay, a tidal island off the northwest coast of mainland, the largest of the Orkney Islands, confirms that by the early 9th century, Norse settlers had established a permanent foothold. These first arrivals were not peaceful farmers seeking new land. They were raiders, part of the same wave of Scandinavian expansion that had struck Lindisfarne in 793 and would soon terrorize the coasts of Ireland and Francia. The Pictish inhabitants of Orkney, whose sophisticated culture had produced the enigmatic symbol stones and the massive brocks, circular stone towers that dotted the landscape, were quickly overwhelmed. The Norse possessed superior naval technology, the fearsome longship with its shallow draft that could navigate both open seas and narrow inlets, and a warrior ethos that glorified conquest. The Pictish resistance, such as it was, crumbled, and within a generation, the native population had been subjugated, enslaved, or assimilated into the incoming Norse society. However, assimilation was a two-way process, and the genetic and cultural legacy of the Picts would prove remarkably resilient, creating a hybrid Norse-Pictish identity that would become the hallmark of Arcadian civilization. The Orkneyinga Saga, the 13th century Icelandic text that is our primary narrative source for this period, opens with the declaration that Orkney was settled in the days of Harald Fairhair, the king of Norway. But this is a simplification that compresses a much longer and more complex process of colonization into a single, politically convenient moment of royal conquest. The reality was messier, bloodier, and far more interesting. The transformation of Orkney from a Pictish archipelago into a Norse power center was catalyzed by its incorporation into the ambitions of Harald Fairhair, the legendary king who unified Norway under his sole rule around the year 872. According to the saga tradition, Harald sailed west with a large fleet to subdue the Vikings who had been using Orkney and Shetland as bases for raids against his newly consolidated kingdom. The story, as told in the Heimskringla and the Orkneyinga Saga, is that Harald defeated a coalition of pirate Vikings in a great sea battle and, in recompense for the death of his son Ivar, granted the earldom of Orkney and Shetland to Ragnvald Eysteinsson, the Jarl of Moor in western Norway, a loyal follower who had distinguished himself in the campaign. Ragnvald, however, did not want to rule the islands himself. He passed the title to his brother Sigurd, who became Sigurd the Mighty, the first historically attested Jarl of Orkney. This political arrangement, which placed the islands under the nominal suzerainty of the Norwegian crown while leaving day-to-day governance in the hands of a locally based Jarl, established a pattern that would persist for centuries. The Jarls of Orkney were, in theory, vassals of the kings of Norway, required to pay tribute and provide military service, but in practice, the distance, over 400 kilometers of open sea, gave them an autonomy that other Norwegian nobles could only dream of. The Norwegian crown was a distant, often abstract presence, and the Jarls of Orkney quickly learned to operate as independent sovereigns, forging their own alliances, fighting their own wars, and accumulating wealth and territory that would eventually make them among the most powerful men in the Norse world. Sigurd the Mighty, who ruled from roughly 875 to 892, set the template for the kind of Jarl Orkney would produce: a warrior of immense personal charisma, boundless ambition, and a ruthless streak that manifested in spectacular acts of violence and territorial expansion. The Orkneyinga Saga recounts that Sigurd extended his power south into Caithness and Sutherland on the Scottish mainland, north into Shetland, and even westward into the Hebrides, building a regional hegemony that transformed the earldom from a cluster of islands into a multi-territorial lordship straddling the Pentland Firth. Sigurd's death, as the saga tells it, was the stuff of legend. He challenged a Scottish chieftain named Maelbrigg to a battle of 40 men on each side, but Sigurd treacherously brought 80 men, defeated and decapitated Maelbrigg, and hung the head from his saddle as a trophy. As he rode, the tooth of the severed head gashed his leg, the wound became infected, and Sigurd died of septicemia, a death that the saga presents as divine retribution for his oath-breaking. Whether this story is historically accurate or a later moralizing addition, it captures the ethos of the early Orkney Jarls: bold, cunning, and ultimately consumed by the violence they unleashed. Sigurd's reign established Orkney not as a quiet agricultural settlement but as a military power, a base for expansion, and a proving ground for the kind of charismatic, often terrifying leaders who would dominate the Norse world for the next 200 years. His tomb, according to tradition, is the massive burial mound known as Sigurd's Hall, on the island of Edi, a site that still commands the landscape and draws visitors who come to stand in the shadow of Orkney's first great Jarl. The geography of Orkney itself shaped the kind of power that the Jarls could wield. The islands are largely flat and green, with rich, fertile soils that, despite the harsh climate, support productive farming. Unlike the mountainous fjords of Norway, where agriculture was confined to narrow strips of land, Orkney offered extensive pastures for cattle and sheep and arable fields for barley and oats. This agricultural base provided a stable economic foundation that could support a warrior aristocracy and its retainers without the constant need for plunder. The surrounding seas were teeming with fish, seals, and whales, and the tidal currents that raced through the channels between the islands, some of the fastest in the world, created natural harbors and predictable navigation routes that the Norse mastered with their intimate knowledge of seamanship. The island of Mainland, which contains the modern administrative center of Kirkwall, was the heart of the earldom, but the smaller islands, Sandy, Westray, Rousey, Stronsey, Shappensey, each had their own chieftains, their own farms, and their own fleets of boats that could be mobilized for war. The Orkney earldom was thus a confederation of island communities, united by loyalty to a single jarl but retaining a fierce local identity that would sometimes boil over into rebellion. The Norse settlers built their farmsteads, known as byar, on the most fertile land, often on the same sites that the Picts had occupied, and the names they gave these places: Hrossey, the old name for mainland, meaning Horse Island; Rinarsi, modern North Ronaldsay; and Papi, the island of the priests, speak to a landscape that was both newly conquered and deeply layered with older meanings. The sea, however, was always the dominant element, and the Jarls who prospered were those who understood that power in Orkney was not rooted in the land but in the waves that surrounded it. The earldom that Sigurd the Mighty hacked out of the Orkney soil, and the surrounding seas did not pass smoothly to his heirs, for the very concept of orderly succession was alien to the Norse world of the 9th and 10th centuries. Upon Sigurd's death, the earldom reverted to the family of Ragnvald Eystein, the original grantee of the title, who dispatched his son Halad to rule the islands. Halad, however, proved unable to defend Orkney against the depredations of pirate Vikings who continued to use the islands as a raiding base, and after a year of ineffective rule, he returned to Norway in disgrace, complaining that the freebooters were impossible to control. The earldom then passed to Ragnvald's youngest son, Einar, a man whom the sagas describe as ugly, one-eyed, and of a surly disposition, but whose political and military genius would lay the permanent foundations of the Orkney earldom. Einar, known to history as Thorfinn, arrived in Orkney around the year 893 and immediately set about establishing a system of governance that combined military force with economic innovation. The nickname, Thorfinn, derived from his promotion of peat cutting as a source of fuel, a critical innovation in the treeless Orkney landscape where wood was scarce and driftwood from across the Atlantic was a precious commodity. By organizing the systematic exploitation of peat bogs, Einar ensured that the island's inhabitants could heat their homes and work their forges without depending on imports, a seemingly mundane development that had profound implications for the island's self-sufficiency and, by extension, their political independence. Einar's reign also saw the formalization of the relationship between the Jarl and the Norwegian crown, an arrangement that would define the earldom's constitutional status for the next 3 centuries. The meeting between Thorfinn and King Harald Fairhair, as recounted in the sagas, is a classic confrontation between royal authority and local autonomy, and the outcome established a precedent that the Jarls of Orkney would repeatedly invoke in their dealings with later Norwegian kings. Harald, having recently consolidated his power in Norway, demanded that Einar pay tribute for the islands, a demand that the Jarl initially resisted, citing the poverty of the land and the independence of the Orkney farmers. After a series of negotiations, Einar agreed to pay a lump sum on behalf of the islanders, but he insisted that in return, the farmers would receive the Odo rights, the allodial, hereditary ownership of their land, that they had previously held under Norse custom. This was a masterstroke of political bargaining. Einar effectively purchased the king's nominal overlordship, while securing the property rights of his freeholders, binding the loyalty of the Orkney farmers to himself rather than to the distant crown. The Odo rights remained a cornerstone of Arcadian law throughout the medieval period and beyond, and the independence they fostered would be repeatedly cited by later Jarls as a bulwark against royal encroachment. Harald, for his part, accepted the arrangement because it gave him a face-saving acknowledgement of his sovereignty and a reliable source of tribute without the expense of maintaining a permanent garrison in the islands. This pragmatic accommodation, a king who claimed authority but rarely exercised it, and a Jarl who ruled independently but paid a token of allegiance, was the political formula that allowed the Orkney earldom to flourish as a semi-autonomous state within the loose framework of the Norwegian realm. Thorfinn's rule also saw the first significant expansion of Orkney's territorial reach beyond the islands themselves. The saga records that Einar launched a campaign against the pirates who had plagued his predecessor, hunting them down in the waters around Shetland and the Hebrides and establishing Orkney's naval supremacy in the region. He also extended his authority onto the Scottish mainland, consolidating control over Caithness, the peninsula directly across the Pentland Firth from Orkney, which would become a permanent appanage of the earldom and a source of both revenue and conflict for centuries to come. The acquisition of Caithness was strategically vital. It provided the Jarls with a foothold on the British mainland, access to timber and other resources not available on the islands, and a buffer zone against the Scottish kingdoms to the south. The incorporation of Caithness into the earldom also marked the beginning of a long and complex relationship between the Norse rulers of Orkney and the Gaelic and Pictish populations of northern Scotland, a relationship that involved intermarriage, cultural exchange, and periodic warfare. By the time of Einar's death, around the year 910, the Orkney earldom was no longer a remote island dependency but a territorial lordship with interests and ambitions that spanned the entire northern British Isles. The Jarls who succeeded him would build on this foundation, expanding the earldom to its maximum extent and engaging with the major political forces of the medieval North Atlantic world. The internal dynamics of the earldom during this formative period were shaped by the peculiar institutions of Norse governance, which blended elements of tribal chieftaincy, royal administration, and personal lordship into a flexible but often unstable political system. The Jarl's authority rested on 3 pillars: his personal retinue of warriors, known as the Herd, who swore oaths of loyalty to him and formed the core of his military force, the support of the free farmers, the Bondi, who expected protection and just governance in return for their taxes and military service, and the acknowledgement of the Norwegian king, whose formal grant of the title conferred legitimacy even if it brought little practical power. Balancing these three constituencies required a deft political touch, and the Jarls who failed to do so, those who were too harsh, too weak, or too distant, quickly found themselves deposed or killed. The Orkneyinga Saga is replete with stories of Jarls who were burned alive in their halls by disgruntled farmers, assassinated by rival claimants to the earldom, or defeated in battle by external enemies. The average tenure of an Orkney Jarl was shockingly short, and the succession was rarely peaceful. Brothers fought brothers, uncles slew nephews, and the earldom was often divided among multiple co-rulers as a compromise to prevent civil war. This division of the earldom, which occurred repeatedly throughout the 10th and 11th centuries, created a constantly shifting political landscape in which alliances were temporary, loyalties were conditional, and power was measured by the number of ships a Jarl could put to sea. Despite, or perhaps because of, this political instability, the Orkney earldom developed a robust identity that distinguished it from both Norway and the neighboring Gaelic kingdoms. The Orkney Norse, known as Orkneyinga, developed their own dialect of Old Norse, enriched with loanwords from Gaelic and Pictish, and their own distinct legal traditions, the Orkney law, which was codified in the later medieval period but drew on centuries of customary practice. The law regulated everything from inheritance and marriage to whale stranding rights and the maintenance of beacons for coastal defense, reflecting a society that was highly organized and deeply attuned to the rhythms of the sea. The assembly, or thing, where free men gathered to settle disputes and make communal decisions, was held at various locations throughout the islands, with the main thing site possibly located at the Ring of Brough, the great Neolithic stone circle on mainland that the Norse repurposed as a sacred and judicial space. The use of Brough, a monument already 3,000 years old when the Norse arrived, as a thing site is a powerful illustration of how the newcomers absorbed and adapted the landscape of their predecessors, layering their own meanings onto ancient places. The earldom was, in a very real sense, a maritime polity, its boundaries defined not by walls or rivers but by the reach of its longships, and its identity forged in the common experience of navigating the treacherous waters of the Pentland Firth and the North Atlantic. This maritime orientation gave the Orkney Jarls a strategic outlook that was fundamentally different from that of land-based lords. They thought in terms of sea lanes, currents, and harbors, not roads, bridges, and mountain passes, and their empire, when it came, would be an empire of the waves. The 10th century witnessed the maturation of the Orkney earldom into a formidable regional power under a succession of Jarls whose deeds, though often embellished by the saga writers, are corroborated by annalistic sources and the archaeological record. After the death of Thorfinn, the earldom passed through a series of complex successions that saw the title divided among multiple descendants, a practice that reflected the Norse custom of partible inheritance but that frequently led to fratricidal conflict. The most prominent of these early 10th century Jarls was Thorfinn Skullsplitter, a grandson of Thorfinn who earned his memorable name for his prowess in battle and who ruled for a lengthy period, possibly from around 910 to 963, though the chronology is uncertain. Thorfinn consolidated Orkney's hold on Caithness, repelled incursions from the Scottish kings to the south, and oversaw a period of relative stability and prosperity during which the island's agricultural infrastructure was expanded and the first stone churches may have been built. The Orkneyinga Saga credits Thorfinn with the establishment of the earldom's administrative structure, including the division of the islands into skatlands, or tax districts, each responsible for providing a specified number of armed men and ships to the Jarl's levy. This system, which persisted for centuries, allowed the Jarls to mobilize their forces rapidly in times of crisis and to project power far beyond the island's shores. Thorfinn was buried in a mound on the island of Rousey, and his grave, like that of Sigurd the Mighty, became a site of local veneration, a physical link to the earldom's founding dynasty that later generations would visit to draw legitimacy and inspiration. The period of Thorfinn Skullsplitter's rule also saw the beginnings of Orkney's entanglement in the complex politics of the Irish Sea region, an entanglement that would culminate in the earldom's involvement in the climactic battles of the Viking Age. The Norse settlers of Orkney had always maintained connections with their kin in the Hebrides, the Isle of Man, and the Norse colonies in Ireland, and as the 10th century progressed, these connections deepened into political alliances and military collaborations. The Jarls of Orkney began to intervene in the dynastic conflicts of the Uimar, the Norse dynasty that ruled Dublin and intermittently controlled the kingdom of Jorvik, providing ships and warriors in return for silver, slaves, and a share of the plunder. This involvement in the Viking politics of the south brought Orkney into contact with the larger forces that were reshaping the British Isles. The rise of the Kingdom of Alba under the MacAlpin dynasty, the consolidation of the Kingdom of England under the House of Wessex, and the ongoing wars between the Irish kings and the Norse enclaves. Orkney's geographical position made it a natural staging ground for expeditions southward, and the Jarls who controlled the islands could demand a price for safe passage or actively participate in the campaigns, reaping profits that enriched the earldom's treasury and funded further expansion. By the middle of the 10th century, Orkney was no longer a peripheral region but an integral part of the Viking political universe, its Jarls players on a stage that stretched from the Arctic Circle to the Mediterranean. The death of Thorfinn Skullsplitter plunged the earldom into a period of internecine warfare that would become characteristic of Orkney's political history. His sons, Arnfinn, Havard, Jot, Hlodver, and Scully, fought among themselves for control of the islands, a conflict that lasted for years and decimated the Jarl's family. The Orkneyinga Saga recounts the grim details. Arnfinn was murdered by his wife, a Scottish princess named Ragnhild, who then married his brother Havard. She later had Havard killed as well and wedded Jot, who was killed in battle against a rival claimant. The saga's portrayal of Ragnhild as a scheming femme fatale reflects the misogyny of the saga tradition, but it also hints at the active political role that women, especially those of royal lineage, could play in the dynastic struggles of the Norse world. After the carnage subsided, the earldom was reunited under Hlodver, who ruled from roughly 963 to 980 and who continued the work of consolidation and expansion, strengthening Orkney's hold on Caithness and the Hebrides. Hlodver married a woman named Ivan, who according to the saga was the daughter of an Irish king, and this marriage alliance, like many others contracted by the Orkney Jarls, reflects the deliberate policy of integrating the Norse earldom into the political fabric of Gaelic society. The children of these mixed marriages, Hlodver and Ian's son was Sigurd the Stout, one of the most famous of all the Orkney Jarls, grew up bilingual, bicultural, and adept at navigating the treacherous waters of both Norse and Gaelic politics. Sigurd the Stout, also known as Sigurd Hlodverson, ruled Orkney from approximately 980 to 1014 and presided over the earldom's greatest period of territorial expansion and military power. Sigurd was a formidable warrior and a shrewd politician who extended Orkney's control over the entire northern Scottish mainland, including Caithness, Sutherland, and parts of Ross, as well as the Hebrides and the Isle of Man. The saga describes him as a man of great size and strength, wise and far-seeing, and a great warrior. And the historical record, though fragmentary, supports the image of a jarl who commanded respect and fear throughout the North Atlantic. Sigurd's reign coincided with the height of Viking activity in the British Isles, and he participated in the great campaigns of the age, including the wars against the English King Athelred the Unready and the conflicts that culminated in the Battle of Clontarf in 1014. Sigurd's involvement in Clontarf, where he fought on the side of the Dublin Norse and their Leinster allies against the Irish High King Brian Boru, is a pivotal moment in Orkney's history. According to the saga, Sigurd carried a raven banner woven by his mother, which was said to grant victory to the side it flew over but death to the man who carried it. All of Sigurd's standard-bearers were killed, one after another, until Sigurd himself, in desperation, wrapped the banner around his body and charged into the Irish lines, where he was cut down. The banner story is clearly legendary, but Sigurd's death at Clontarf is historically attested in the Irish annals, which record that the Jarl of the Orkneys was among the many notable men who fell on that bloody day. Sigurd's death at Clontarf left the earldom to his young sons, who were dispatched to Orkney under the protection of their grandfather, the Scottish King Malcolm II. The succession was complicated, as always, by the existence of multiple heirs. Sigurd had left 4 sons, Sumarlidi, Birsay, Einar Rymouth, and Thorfinn, the youngest, who was only a child at the time of his father's death. The earldom was partitioned among the older brothers, with Thorfinn initially receiving only a small portion centered on Caithness. This partition, intended to prevent fratricidal conflict, instead set the stage for one of the most dramatic episodes in Orkney's history, a conflict that would pit the Jarls against the growing power of the Norwegian crown and ultimately produce the greatest of all the Orkney rulers, the man who would be known to history as Thorfinn the Mighty. The death of Sigurd the Stout thus marked both an end and a beginning, the end of the old order, in which Orkney was one power among many in the Viking world, and the beginning of a new era, in which the earldom, under the leadership of Sigurd's remarkable son, would reach its apogee and challenge the very structure of authority in the medieval North. The figure who towers over the entire history of Orkney, both in the literary imagination and in the historical record, is Thorfinn Sigurdsson, known to posterity as Thorfinn the Mighty, whose long reign from roughly 1014 to 1065 represents the zenith of the earldom's power, wealth, and territorial extent. Thorfinn was only 5 years old when his father fell at Clontarf, and he spent his childhood at the court of his maternal grandfather, Malcolm II, the King of Scots, an upbringing that gave him an intimate understanding of Scottish politics and a set of alliances that would prove invaluable in his later career. The Orkneyinga Saga devotes more space to Thorfinn than to any other Jarl, portraying him as the ideal Norse ruler, tall, strong, handsome, generous to his friends, ruthless to his enemies, and possessed of a keen strategic intelligence that allowed him to outmaneuver his rivals both on the battlefield and in the halls of power. The sagas claim that Thorfinn ruled over 9 earldoms: Orkney, Shetland, Caithness, Sutherland, Ross, Moray, the Hebrides, Galloway, and a portion of Ireland, is almost certainly an exaggeration, but it reflects a core truth. Thorfinn built a personal empire that stretched from the Arctic to the Irish Sea, a maritime hegemony that made him one of the most powerful men in Northern Europe. The historical Thorfinn, stripped of saga embellishment, emerges from the contemporary sources as a ruler of exceptional ability who successfully managed the competing demands of his Norwegian overlord, his Scottish allies, and his own fiercely independent Norse subjects, creating a political order that, though it did not long survive his death, left a permanent imprint on the region. The early years of Thorfinn's rule were dominated by conflict with his half-brother Einar Rymouth, who had inherited a portion of the earldom, and who proved to be a cruel and rapacious lord. The saga describes Einar as an unpopular man, hard and unjust, and he took more than his share of the taxes and forced the farmers to work for him without pay. The free farmers of Orkney, who cherished their Odo rights and their traditional liberties, chafed under Einar's exactions, and the discontent eventually erupted into open rebellion. Thorfinn, who had by this time come of age and taken control of his portion of the earldom in Caithness, positioned himself as the champion of the farmers' cause, a shrewd political move that allowed him to present his bid for supremacy as a defense of traditional liberties rather than a naked power grab. The brothers clashed in a series of skirmishes and diplomatic maneuvers, and Einar was eventually killed by a rival named Thorkel Fostri, a foster father figure to Thorfinn, who cut off Einar's head and presented it to the young Jarl. The saga treats this act as a justifiable execution of a tyrant, but it also highlights the brutal realities of Orkney politics, where succession was determined not by primogeniture or election but by the sword. With Einar dead, Thorfinn consolidated his control over the entire earldom, a process that took several years and required him to negotiate with his remaining brother Birsay, who was willing to accept a subordinate role in exchange for a generous share of the revenues. Thorfinn's relationship with the Norwegian crown was complex and, at times, openly hostile. The king of Norway during much of Thorfinn's reign was Magnus the Good, and later Harald Hardrada, the famed warrior king who would die at Stamford Bridge in 1066. Both kings claimed the right to collect tribute from Orkney and to confirm the appointment of its jarls, claims that Thorfinn challenged by asserting his own quasi-royal status. In the 1040s, Thorfinn traveled to Norway to negotiate directly with Magnus, and the saga describes a tense meeting in which the Jarl, by a combination of flattery, argument, and veiled threats, persuaded the king to grant him the whole of the Orkneys and Shetlands without any tribute. This was an extraordinary concession, tantamount to recognition of Thorfinn's independence, and it allowed the Jarl to return to his islands as a ruler who owed his crown to no one. When Harald Hardrada succeeded Magnus, relations soured, and Thorfinn faced a Norwegian invasion fleet sent to bring the earldom to heel. The Jarl met the threat with a combination of diplomacy and military preparation, mobilizing his fleet and manning the coastal beacons that would alert the island's defenders to the approach of hostile ships. The invasion never materialized in full force, and Thorfinn was able to maintain his independence until the end of his reign. The ability of an Orkney Jarl to defy a king as formidable as Harald Hardrada is a testament to the military strength and political cohesion that Thorfinn had built. The territorial expansion achieved by Thorfinn the Mighty was unprecedented and was never again equaled by any Orkney ruler. His authority extended over the entire northern Scottish mainland, including the crucial province of Moray, which brought him into direct conflict with the rising power of the Scottish monarchy. The saga records that Thorfinn fought a great battle at Torfness, possibly somewhere in Caithness or Sutherland, against a Scottish army led by Carl Hundison, a figure who may be a literary composite of various Scottish kings, possibly Macbeth himself, who ruled from 1040 to 1057. The battle, which the saga describes in vivid detail with the standard motifs of berserker fury and heroic last stands, resulted in a decisive victory for Thorfinn, who pursued the fleeing Scots for miles and exacted a terrible slaughter. Contemporary Scottish sources, notably the Annals of Tigernach, mention a conflict between the Orkneymen and the Scots in this period, lending some historical weight to the saga's account. Thorfinn's control over the western seaboard, including the Hebrides and possibly parts of the Irish coast, gave him access to the rich plunder of the Irish sea trade routes and allowed him to levy tribute from the Gaelic chieftains of the region. The Jarl became a patron of poets and skalds, who sang his praises in the courts of the north, and his reputation spread as far as the Byzantine Empire, where Norse mercenaries in the Varangian Guard would have heard tales of the great Jarl of the northern seas. Thorfinn's later years were devoted to consolidating his empire and securing the succession for his sons, Paul and Erland. He moved the seat of the earldom to the new settlement at Birsay, on the northwest coast of mainland, where he built a magnificent hall and a stone church, the remains of which are still visible today. The Brough of Birsay, a tidal island connected to mainland by a causeway, became the administrative and ceremonial center of the earldom, a place where the Jarl received foreign embassies, held court for his chieftains, and worshipped in the new Christian faith that had replaced the old pagan gods. Thorfinn himself had been baptized in his youth, though his Christianity was, like that of many Norse rulers of the period, a pragmatic affair that coexisted with the older beliefs and the warrior ethos of the sagas. The church he built at Birsay, dedicated to St. Peter, was one of the earliest stone churches in the Norse North Atlantic, and its construction, which required imported skilled labor and materials, was a statement of Thorfinn's wealth and his commitment to the new religious order that was transforming Scandinavian society. The Jarl died around 1065, having ruled for over 50 years, an extraordinary longevity in a period when few men survived to old age and fewer still died in their beds. His body was interred in the church at Birsay, and his death marked the end of Orkney's golden age. The earldom would continue for another century and a half, but never again would an Orkney Jarl wield the kind of power that Thorfinn the Mighty had commanded, a power that had humbled kings, expanded frontiers, and carved a name into the annals of the medieval world that still echoes down the centuries. The military power that underpinned the Orkney earldom throughout its history was founded on the mastery of naval technology and the strategic exploitation of the island's unique maritime geography. The Orkney Jarls commanded fleets of longships, the iconic vessels that had carried the Vikings across the oceans of the world, and these ships were not simply instruments of war. They were the physical embodiment of the earldom's sovereignty, the means by which the Jarls projected their authority, collected their taxes, and defended their territories. The Norse shipwrights of Orkney, working with imported timber from Norway and the Scottish mainland, as well as with driftwood that washed ashore after long journeys across the Atlantic, developed local variations of the classic longship design, adapting the vessels to the particular conditions of the North Sea and the Pentland Firth. Archaeological finds at sites such as Skara, on the island of Sandy, where a Viking boat burial was excavated in 1991, have provided crucial evidence for the construction and outfitting of Orkney ships. The Skara boat, dating to around 875 to 950, was a small vessel approximately 6 meters long, clinker-built with iron rivets, and contained the remains of 3 individuals, a man, a woman, and a child, along with a rich assemblage of grave goods including a sword, a quiver of arrows, a bone comb, and a beautifully carved whalebone plaque. The boat burial, a custom that connected the maritime ethos of the Norse to their beliefs about the afterlife, demonstrates the central importance of ships in Orkney society. The larger warships that the Jarls deployed in their campaigns were capable of carrying between 40 and 80 warriors each, with a shallow draft that allowed them to navigate rivers, beach on unprotected shores, and escape pursuit by heavier vessels. The Orkneyinga Saga frequently describes the mobilization of these fleets, which could number in the dozens or even hundreds of ships when the Jarl summoned his full levy, the Ledang, from the islands and the mainland territories. The Ledang system, which was the Norse equivalent of a naval militia, required each district to provide a certain number of ships and men for a specified period of service each year, typically 2 or 3 months in the summer, when the weather was favorable for campaigning. The Jarl's ability to mobilize this force quickly and efficiently was the ultimate test of his political authority, and a Jarl who could not command the loyalty of the districts was a Jarl who could not defend his realm. The fleet, once assembled, would rendezvous at a designated anchorage such as the sheltered waters of Scapa Flow, the great natural harbor in the heart of the Orkney archipelago that would later become the base for the British Grand Fleet in both world wars. From Scapa Flow, the Jarl could dispatch squadrons south into the Pentland Firth and toward the Scottish mainland, west toward the Hebrides and Ireland, or north toward Shetland and the Faroes, a strategic flexibility that made Orkney the naval pivot of the Viking North Atlantic. The battles fought by the Orkney fleets were typically close-quarters engagements in which ships were lashed together to form a floating platform for hand-to-hand combat. The warriors, armed with swords, axes, spears, and bows, would exchange missiles as the ships closed, and then board the enemy vessels in a furious melee that left little room for tactical finesse. The Jarls themselves fought in the front rank, and many of them died in these naval clashes, their bodies committed to the sea that had been the source of their power. The Orkneyinga Saga contains numerous accounts of such battles, including the Great Sea Fight at Hjörungavagr, off the coast of Norway, in which the Jarl of Orkney fought alongside the legendary Jomsvikings, an elite brotherhood of Viking mercenaries, against the forces of the Norwegian king. The saga's account of Hjörungavagr is a masterpiece of battle narrative, filled with memorable vignettes of individual heroism, such as the warrior who continued to fight after both his hands had been cut off, and the Jarl who, seeing his standard-bearer fall, shouted, "Carry the banner in your teeth!" The historicity of these details is questionable, but they convey the ethos of the Orkney warrior class, an ethos in which death in battle was the highest honor, and the coward who fled was beneath contempt. The military infrastructure of the earldom extended far beyond the ships themselves to encompass a network of coastal fortifications, beacon systems, and muster points that allowed the Jarls to respond rapidly to threats. The shores of Orkney are dotted with the remains of Norse watchtowers and naus, the scooped-out boat shelters that protected the longships when they were not at sea. The beacon system, which used fires lit on hilltops to relay warnings across the islands, could alert the entire archipelago of an approaching enemy fleet within hours, giving the Jarl time to assemble his forces and choose his ground. The island of Hoy, with its high cliffs and commanding views, was a particularly important link in this defensive chain, and the name, Hoy, itself derives from the Old Norse Hey, meaning high island. The military organization of Orkney was thus a holistic system that integrated ships, men, fortifications, and communications into a single defensive apparatus, a system that was, for most of the earldom's history, remarkably effective. The few attempts by external powers to invade Orkney, by the Scottish kings, the Norwegian kings, or rival Viking warlords, were almost always repulsed, often with heavy losses, a testament to the island's natural defenses and the martial prowess of their inhabitants. The weapons and armor used by the Orkney warriors are known to us from the grave goods found in the island's numerous Viking Age cemeteries. Swords were the most prestigious weapons, often of Frankish or Norwegian manufacture and passed down through generations as heirlooms, their blades inscribed with the names of their makers, such as the famous Ulfbert swords produced in the Rhineland. The Orkneyinga Saga records that Thorfinn the Mighty possessed a sword named Fifa, which was the keenest of all swords, and that he bequeathed it to his son Paul, a detail that, whether factual or fictional, illustrates the symbolic importance of these weapons as tokens of dynastic legitimacy. Axes were the common weapon of the ordinary warrior, and the Orkney graves have yielded many examples of the broad-bladed Viking axe, a fearsome weapon capable of cleaving through shield and mail. Spears, arrows, and shields completed the warrior's panoply, and the graves at Skara and elsewhere have provided evidence of the leather, wood, and iron components of this equipment. The warriors who wielded these weapons were not a standing army. They were farmers and fishermen for most of the year, who took up arms when the Jarl called and returned to their fields and boats when the campaign was over. This militia system, while lacking the professionalism of later medieval armies, was perfectly suited to the needs of a maritime earldom that required a large, flexible, and self-sustaining force. The military history of Orkney is thus a history of the sea and the men who mastered it, a history written in salt, iron, and blood, and it is inseparable from the political and cultural history of the islands themselves. The integration of the Norse and Pictish populations of Orkney was a process that unfolded over generations, producing a hybrid culture that is unique in the medieval world and whose traces are still visible in the archaeology, language, and folklore of the islands today. When the first Norse settlers arrived in the late 8th and early 9th centuries, they encountered a Pictish society that had flourished in the northern British Isles for at least 1,000 years, a people whose monumental architecture, sophisticated metalwork, and complex symbolic systems spoke to a civilization of considerable achievement. The Picts of Orkney left behind no written records of their own. Everything we know about them comes from the accounts of their enemies, the archaeological remains they left behind, and the faint echoes of their language and culture that survived into the Norse period. The Pictish Brochs, the great circular towers that still dominate the Orkney landscape at sites like Gurnes and Mihal, were in use at the time of the Norse arrival, and there is evidence that some of them were occupied by the newcomers, who adapted these massive stone structures to their own needs. The genetic evidence, derived from studies of modern Akkadian DNA, indicates that the Norse settlers did not simply exterminate the Pictish population but intermarried with them, a pattern that is consistent with the historical record of other Norse colonies, such as Iceland and the Faroes, where the maternal lineages are predominantly Celtic. The modern Akkadian population carries a mix of Scandinavian and indigenous British genetic markers, a biological testament to the centuries of coexistence and intermingling that followed the initial conquest. The linguistic legacy of the Pictish-Norse encounter is written into the very names of the Orkney landscape, a toponymic record that allows us to trace the process of cultural fusion in precise detail. The Norse settlers renamed almost every geographical feature of the islands, replacing Pictish and earlier Celtic names with Old Norse descriptors. I, or EY, for island, Ness, for headland, Wake, for bay, Firth, for fjord, Dale, for valley, Home, for islet, Scary, for reef, and so on. Yet some Pictish names survived, particularly for the larger islands, suggesting that these were so well established that even the incoming Norse adopted them, perhaps in a modified form. The name, Orkney, itself may derive from a Pictish tribal name, Orcades, which the Romans recorded, and the islands of Rousey, Hrolfsey, Westray, Vestray, and Stransey, all bear Norse names superimposed on older roots. The Orkney dialect of Scots, which developed in the later medieval period after the islands passed to Scottish rule, contains a substantial Norse vocabulary that distinguishes it from mainland Scots. Words like geo, for a narrow inlet, Vo for a bay, scat for a tax, and udal for the system of allodial land tenure that descended directly from the Odo rights of the Norse period. The survival of these Norse loanwords, along with a distinctive accent characterized by a sing-song intonation and the retention of certain Old Norse vowel sounds, is a living connection to the earldom that once governed these islands. The archaeological record of the Norse Pictish encounter is extraordinarily rich, and nowhere is it more vividly preserved than at the Brough of Birsay, the tidal island settlement that was the seat of the earldom during the reign of Thorfinn the Mighty. The site, which was excavated primarily in the 1970s under the direction of Christopher Morris, revealed a complex of Norse buildings overlying earlier Pictish structures, a stratigraphic sequence that documents the transition from one culture to the other. The Pictish phase of the site, dating to the 7th and 8th centuries, included a well-built stone hall and a series of smaller structures, along with evidence of metalworking and the production of fine pottery. The Norse phase, which began in the early 9th century, saw the construction of a new series of longhouses built in the classic Viking style, with central hearths, benches along the walls, and byres at one end for the winter stalling of cattle. The artifacts recovered from the Norse levels, bone combs, spindle whorls, fishing weights, iron knives, and fragments of soapstone vessels imported from Norway, paint a picture of a prosperous farming and fishing community that maintained close commercial ties with the Scandinavian homeland. The discovery of a small Pictish symbol stone, reused as a building block in the Norse wall, is a poignant illustration of the cultural succession. The old order was not obliterated but absorbed, its sacred monuments repurposed as raw material by the newcomers who had, by then, become the new natives. The religious dimension of the Norse Pictish synthesis is particularly fascinating because it involved the encounter between two different pagan systems, both of which were eventually replaced by Christianity, a process that took centuries and left deep marks on the island's spiritual landscape. The Picts, before their conversion to Christianity in the 6th and 7th centuries, practiced a form of paganism about which we know almost nothing, though the symbol stones they erected may have had religious significance. The Norse, of course, worshipped the pantheon of gods that we know from the Eddas and the Sagas, Odin, Thor, Frey, Freya, and the rest, and their religious practices included animal and, according to some sources, human sacrifice, divination, and the worship of sacred groves and stones. The meeting of these two pagan traditions in Orkney would have involved a degree of mutual incomprehension and, perhaps, a certain amount of syncretism, as the two peoples found common ground in their shared reverence for certain places and natural features. The Ring of Brough and the Standing Stones of Stenness, the great Neolithic monuments that had stood in the Orkney landscape for 3,000 years before the Norse arrived, almost certainly played a role in both Pictish and Norse religious life, serving as assembly places and possibly as sites for rituals whose exact nature we can only guess. The Norse custom of holding their Thing assemblies at Brough was, in a sense, a continuation of a much older tradition of using the site for communal gatherings, a tradition that stretched back to the Neolithic farmers who had originally erected the stones. The conversion of Orkney to Christianity was a gradual process that began in the late 10th century and was largely complete by the middle of the 11th, though pagan practices persisted in some areas for much longer. The Norwegian king Olaf Tryggvason, a zealous Christian who ruled from 995 to 1000, is credited by the sagas with forcibly converting the Orkneymen during a visit to the islands, threatening to kill the Jarl Sigurd the Stout's son unless Sigurd and his people accepted baptism. Sigurd, ever the pragmatist, agreed, and the islands were nominally Christianized overnight, though the conversion was likely more protracted and less dramatic than the saga suggests. The stone churches that began to appear in Orkney in the 11th century, such as the round-towered church at Egilsey and the cathedral at Birsay, marked the physical presence of the new faith on the landscape, but the old beliefs died hard. The Orkneyinga Saga, written in the 13th century by a Christian author, still contains numerous references to pagan practices and beliefs, often presented as curiosities of a bygone age, but still tinged with a certain nostalgia. The Christianization of Orkney was not a simple replacement of one religion by another but a complex process of negotiation, adaptation, and resistance, in which the old gods retreated slowly into the realm of folklore and superstition, where they survived, in altered form, for centuries. The fusion of Norse and Pictish cultures in Orkney was, in the end, a creative response to the challenges of life in a remote and demanding environment, and the society that emerged from that fusion was stronger, more resilient, and more distinctive than either of its parent cultures could have been alone. The economic foundations of the Orkney earldom were as robust as its military and political institutions, and the prosperity that the islands enjoyed during the Norse period was the product of a diversified and carefully managed economy that exploited every resource the land and sea could provide. Agriculture was the bedrock of the Orkney economy, and the Norse settlers, with their deep knowledge of northern farming techniques, quickly adapted to the island's challenging climate and soils. The principal crops were barley and oats, the hardy grains that could ripen in the short, cool summers, and these were supplemented by the cultivation of flax for linen and, in sheltered spots, small quantities of vegetables such as kale and onions. The livestock raised by the Orkney farmers included cattle, which were prized for their milk and meat, sheep, whose wool was the main source of clothing and a significant trade commodity, pigs, which were allowed to roam the woodlands and moorlands, and the small, sturdy horses known as Orkney ponies, a breed that still exists today and that was used for transport, plowing, and pack work. The management of the grazing lands was a communal affair, regulated by this scattled system, a form of common pasturage that was governed by the Thing Assembly and that prevented overgrazing by allocating grazing rights to each farm. The agricultural surplus, stored in stone-lined pits and wooden granaries, provided the caloric base that supported the Jarl's household, his warriors, and the non-farming population of craftsmen, traders, and clergy who made the earldom function. The sea, however, was the true source of Orkney's wealth, and the island's inhabitants were, first and foremost, a maritime people whose lives were oriented toward the ocean. Fishing was an essential activity, and the waters around Orkney teemed with cod, haddock, ling, scythe, and herring, which were caught using lines, nets, and traps and then dried, salted, or smoked for storage and export. The Orkneyinga Saga mentions fish drying stations on the islands, where vast quantities of cod were prepared for shipment to the markets of Norway and the continent, and archaeological excavations at sites like Brough on Westray have uncovered extensive evidence of medieval fish processing, including the remains of drying racks and the bones of thousands of fish. The export of dried fish was one of the pillars of the Orkney economy, and it linked the islands to the wider commercial networks of medieval Europe, where preserved fish was a staple food, especially during the many fast days prescribed by the Church. Whales, seals, and seabirds were also harvested, providing meat, oil for lamps, and skins for clothing and boat coverings. The scat, or tax, which the Jarl collected from the farmers, was often paid in kind, in butter, cheese, wool, and fish, and the Jarl's warehouses at Birsay and Kirkwall were filled with these products, which were then traded for the luxury goods that the earldom's elite desired. Trade was the third leg of the Orkney economic stool, and the island's position at the crossroads of the North Atlantic made them a natural entrepot for goods flowing between Scandinavia, the British Isles, Iceland, and beyond. The Orkney merchants, many of whom were also farmers and fishermen, sailed their own ships, smaller, beamier knars rather than longships, to the markets of Bergen, Trondheim, Dublin, York, and the fairs of the Frankish and German lands. From Norway, they imported timber, iron, soapstone, and the fine textiles and metalwork that the Orkney elite craved. From the British Isles, they brought wine, salt, pottery, and manufactured goods. From Iceland and the Faroes, they obtained wool, falcons, and the walrus ivory that was a prized luxury in medieval Europe. The Orkney Jarls encouraged this trade by maintaining the peace of the markets, providing safe anchorages for visiting ships, and issuing coinage, though the Orkney mint was small and sporadic, and much of the currency in circulation consisted of foreign coins, particularly the silver pennies of the English and Norwegian kings. The discovery of a silver hoard at Skyle, on the Bay of Skyle in Orkney, in 1858, which contained over 100 items including English, German, and Islamic coins, as well as silver ingots and hacksilver, illustrates the cosmopolitan nature of the Orkney economy and its integration into the global trade networks of the Viking Age. The social structure of the earldom was closely tied to the economic order, with a hierarchy that ranged from the Jarl at the top, through the chieftains and large landowners, to the free farmers, the tenant farmers, and, at the bottom, the thralls, or slaves, who performed the most onerous labor. The thralls, captured in raids or born into servitude, worked the Jarls' domain lands, tended the livestock, and served in the households of the wealthy, and their status, though legally defined as property, was in practice often closer to that of the later serfs, with some rights to personal property and family life. The free farmers, the bandi, were the backbone of Orkney society, and they guarded their Odo rights with fierce determination. The Odo system, which gave the farmer hereditary ownership of his land and the right to pass it on to his descendants without interference from the Jarl or the king, was the legal expression of the farmer's independence, and any attempt by the Jarl to encroach on these rights was met with resistance, sometimes violent. The Jarl's power, therefore, was not absolute but was constrained by the need to maintain the support of the bandi, who provided the military levy and the taxes that sustained the earldom. The relationship between Jarl and farmer was a kind of social contract, unwritten but deeply felt, in which the Jarl guaranteed protection and justice in return for loyalty and service. The economic prosperity of Orkney was, of course, subject to the vagaries of climate, war, and political instability, and the earldom experienced periods of hardship as well as periods of abundance. The Norse settlement of the North Atlantic coincided with the medieval warm period, a climatic optimum that lasted from roughly 950 to 1250, and that allowed agriculture to flourish at latitudes that later became marginal. During this warm period, the growing season in Orkney was longer and the winters less severe, conditions that favored the expansion of farming and the growth of the population. The prosperity of the earldom was thus, in part, a gift of the climate, and when the climate began to cool in the later 13th century, with the onset of the Little Ice Age, the economic foundations of the islands were gradually eroded, contributing to the political decline that would eventually see the earldom absorbed into the Scottish kingdom. The economic history of Orkney is, in many ways, a microcosm of the larger history of the medieval North Atlantic, a story of human ingenuity and adaptation in the face of a challenging environment, and a reminder that the fortunes of nations are often determined by forces beyond human control. The religious transformation of Orkney from a pagan Norse society to a Christian one was one of the most profound changes that the islands experienced during the earldom period, and it occurred against a backdrop of political maneuvering, cultural resistance, and the slow, patient work of missionaries and church builders. The pagan religion of the Norse, with its pantheon of gods, Odin, the All-Father, god of wisdom, war, and poetry, Thor, the Thunderer, protector of mankind, Frey, the god of fertility, and the many other deities of the Norse cosmos, was not a centralized faith with a professional priesthood and a fixed set of doctrines, but a diffuse collection of beliefs and practices that varied from place to place and were intimately tied to the cycles of the seasons, the rhythms of the sea, and the demands of the warrior life. The Orkney Norse worshipped in sacred groves, at particular stones and springs, and in their own homes, where the high-seat pillars, carved with images of the gods, were the focus of domestic ritual. The sagas contain many references to the religious practices of the Orkneymen, including the sacrifice of animals and, according to some accounts, humans, and the casting of runes and lots to divine the will of the gods. The temple at Maeshowe, the great Neolithic chamber tomb on mainland, may have been used by the Norse for religious purposes, and the runic inscriptions carved into its walls by later visitors include invocations to the old gods alongside Christian symbols, a testament to the syncretic nature of Orkney's spiritual life. The arrival of Christianity in Orkney was not a single event but a process that stretched over more than a century, beginning with the first contacts between Norse raiders and Christian communities in the British Isles and culminating in the establishment of a formal ecclesiastical structure under the authority of the Archbishopric of Nidaros in Norway. The initial exposure of the Orkneymen to Christianity came through their interactions with the Christian populations they raided and traded with in Scotland, Ireland, and England. Captured Christian slaves, many of them monks and priests, brought their faith with them into the Norse households, and the process of intermarriage with Christian women from the Gaelic and Pictish communities introduced the new religion into the domestic sphere. The sagas tell of Orkney Jarls who, like many Norse rulers, hedged their bets by invoking both Christ and the old gods, a practice known as double faith, that allowed them to maintain their standing in both the pagan and Christian communities. Sigurd the Stout, for example, is said to have worn a cross on his armor at the Battle of Clontarf but to have consulted pagan oracles before the battle, a pragmatic eclecticism that typified the transitional nature of the period. The decisive moment in the Christianization of Orkney, according to the saga tradition, came with the intervention of King Olaf Tryggvason of Norway in the year 995. Olaf, a convert to Christianity who had been baptized in the Scilly Isles, was a zealous proponent of the new faith who used the power of the Norwegian crown to force Christianity on the reluctant chieftains of the North Atlantic. The Orkneyinga Saga recounts that Olaf, on his way back to Norway after a campaign in the British Isles, landed in Orkney and summoned the Jarl Sigurd the Stout to his ship. "You and all your people shall be baptized," Olaf declared, "or else I will kill you on the spot, and I will ravage all the islands with fire and iron." Sigurd, seeing the overwhelming force that Olaf had at his command, chose baptism for himself and his followers, and the islands were nominally Christian from that moment. Whether this story is historically accurate or a later invention designed to give the Norwegian crown credit for the conversion, it captures the coercive nature of much of the early medieval Christianization process, which was often less a matter of persuasion than of political compulsion. The establishment of the institutional church in Orkney began in earnest in the 11th century, during the reign of Thorfinn the Mighty, who built the first stone church at Birsay and invited clergy from the continent and from England to serve in his domain. The church at Birsay, known as Christ Church, was a small but elegantly constructed building of local stone, with a rectangular nave, a chancel, and perhaps a western tower, and it became the seat of the first bishop of Orkney, who was appointed around the year 1050. The bishopric of Orkney was originally a suffragan of the archbishopric of Hamburg-Bremen, reflecting the German connections of the early Christian missionaries to Scandinavia, but it was later transferred to the jurisdiction of the archbishopric of York and finally, in the 12th century, to the newly established archbishopric of Nidaros in Norway. This shifting ecclesiastical allegiance reflected the political ambiguities of the earldom, which was caught between the spheres of influence of Norway, Scotland, and England, and it contributed to the complex loyalties that would shape Orkney's history in the later Middle Ages. The appointment of Bishop William the Old in 1102 marked the beginning of a long and distinguished episcopate that lasted until 1168, and that oversaw the construction of the great Cathedral of St. Magnus in Kirkwall, one of the finest Romanesque buildings in northern Europe and a monument to the triumph of Christianity in the islands. The old pagan religion did not disappear overnight, however, and the archaeological and literary record contains numerous traces of its persistence long after the formal conversion. The runic inscriptions at Maeshowe, carved by Norse visitors in the 12th century, include not only Christian prayers but also references to Thor and to pagan myths, suggesting that the old stories were still told and the old gods still remembered, even if they were no longer worshipped in public. The Orkneyinga Saga, written by a Christian author, is saturated with pagan motifs and supernatural elements, prophetic dreams, walking dead curses, and magic, that reflect a worldview in which the boundaries between the Christian and pagan were fluid and permeable. The Church, for its part, adopted a strategy of assimilation, incorporating pagan sacred sites and festivals into the Christian calendar, dedicating churches on the sites of former temples, and recasting the old gods as demons or, in some cases, as saints. The fusion of Norse and Christian elements in the religious culture of Orkney created a distinctive spirituality that was neither wholly pagan nor wholly orthodox but was uniquely adapted to the needs and traditions of the island's people. The stone churches that still dot the Orkney landscape, from the grand cathedral at Kirkwall to the tiny, roofless chapels on remote headlands, are the physical legacy of this long and complex process, and they stand today as silent witnesses to the faith that replaced the gods of the Vikings and that still sustains the spiritual life of the islands. The Orkneyinga Saga, the primary literary source for the history of the earldom, is one of the great works of medieval Icelandic literature, and understanding its composition, its biases, and its literary qualities is essential for any critical engagement with the history of Orkney. The saga was written in Iceland in the late 12th or early 13th century, probably around 1200, by an anonymous author who had access to a wide range of oral traditions, earlier written sources, and perhaps the memories of individuals who had visited Orkney or who had connections to the earldom. The saga is part of the genre known as the Orkneyinga Saga, or King Sagas, which recount the lives of Norwegian kings, but it focuses specifically on the Jarls of Orkney from the 9th century to the early 13th, with a particular emphasis on the period from Sigurd the Mighty to the aftermath of the martyrdom of Saint Magnus. The author's purpose was not simply to record historical facts but to craft a compelling narrative that would entertain, edify, and convey moral and political lessons to a contemporary Icelandic audience. The saga is, therefore, a work of literature as much as a work of history, and it must be read with a critical eye, recognizing that its accounts of events are shaped by literary convention, political bias, and the passage of time. The world of the Orkneyinga Saga is a world of vivid, larger-than-life characters whose actions are driven by the primal forces of ambition, honor, revenge, and fate. The Jarls of Orkney are portrayed as heroic figures, but their heroism is of a dark and often tragic kind, marked by violence, treachery, and the relentless pursuit of power. The saga does not flinch from depicting the brutality of the age. The murders, the burnings, the betrayals, and the battles are described with a stark, unemotional precision that gives the narrative a raw power. At the same time, the saga is laced with humor, irony, and moments of unexpected tenderness, as when the Jarl Ragnvald Kalli Kolsson, a poet and adventurer, composes verses about his travels and his loves, or when the saintly Magnus Erlendsson refuses to take up arms in battle and instead prays for his enemies. The literary quality of the saga is uneven, with some sections displaying a sophisticated narrative art and others degenerating into dry lists of names and genealogies, but at its best, the Orkneyinga Saga achieves a kind of stark, Homeric grandeur that places it among the masterpieces of medieval European literature. The historical reliability of the saga is a matter of ongoing debate among scholars, and the consensus is that it must be used cautiously, in conjunction with archaeological, linguistic, and other contemporary sources. The saga was written some 2 to 3 centuries after many of the events it describes, and the oral traditions on which it relied had been subject to the distortions of memory, the embellishments of storytellers, and the political agendas of the descendants of the people involved. The author was a Christian, writing for a Christian audience, and he reinterpreted the pagan past through a Christian lens, often portraying the conversion as a straightforward triumph of good over evil and downplaying the violence and coercion involved. The saga also displays a clear bias in favor of certain lineages and against others, reflecting the dynastic politics of the time of composition. For example, the descendants of Thorfinn the Mighty are treated with considerable sympathy, while their rivals are often portrayed as villains, a bias that may reflect the political alliances of the saga's patrons. Despite these limitations, the Orkneyinga Saga remains an indispensable source for the history of the earldom, providing a level of detail and a sense of the personalities involved that no other source can match, and its account has been corroborated in many respects by the archaeological evidence. The saga's treatment of the relationship between Orkney and the wider Norse world is particularly revealing of the political attitudes of the early 13th century. The saga consistently presents the earldom as an integral part of the Norwegian realm, and the Jarls are depicted as loyal vassals of the Norwegian king, even when their actions suggest a considerable degree of independence. This emphasis on Norwegian sovereignty may reflect the political circumstances of the time of composition, when the Norwegian crown was reasserting its authority over the Norse colonies in the North Atlantic, and when the idea of a unified Norwegian empire was being promoted by the court in Bergen. The saga's insistence on the Jarl's loyalty to the king, even in the face of evidence to the contrary, can be seen as an attempt to legitimize Norwegian claims to Orkney at a time when those claims were being contested by the Scottish crown. The saga is, in this sense, a political document as well as a literary work, and its account of the earldom's history is shaped by the concerns of the present as much as by the realities of the past. The enduring legacy of the Orkneyinga Saga lies in its preservation of a world that would otherwise be largely lost to us. The saga gives us the names and personalities of the Jarls, their wives and children, their friends and enemies, their triumphs and their failures, in a narrative that, for all its flaws, allows us to imagine the lives of the people who built the earldom. It captures the ethos of a warrior society in which honor was everything and death was preferable to shame, and it conveys the rhythms of a maritime world in which the sea was both a highway and a grave. The saga has inspired poets, novelists, and historians for centuries, and it continues to be read and studied today as a window into the Viking past. The modern visitor to Orkney can walk the same landscapes that the saga describes: the cliffs of Hoy, the bays of Rousey, the rolling fields of mainland, and can feel the presence of the Jarls and their people, whose stories are inscribed not only in the pages of the saga but in the very soil of the islands. The Orkneyinga Saga is, in the end, a monument to the men and women of Orkney, a gift of the Icelandic literary imagination to the islands whose history it preserves. The dynastic politics of the Orkney earldom were as intricate and bloody as any in medieval Europe, a labyrinth of rival claims, divided inheritances, and shifting alliances that produced a seemingly endless cycle of conflict and reconciliation. The root cause of this instability was the Norse custom of partible inheritance, which held that a man's property and titles should be divided among all his sons, rather than passing intact to a single heir. In the context of an earldom, this meant that upon the death of a jarl, his territory was often split among multiple co-rulers, each of whom had an equal claim to the title and the revenues of the earldom. The Orkneyinga Saga is replete with examples of this practice. The earldom was divided among the 5 sons of Thorfinn Skullsplitter, among the 3 sons of Sigurd the Stout, and among the 2 sons of Thorfinn the Mighty, to name only a few instances. The result was a political landscape in which the earldom was constantly being fragmented and then reunified through war, assassination, or dynastic accident, a cycle that consumed the energies of the Jarls and their followers and that prevented the emergence of stable, long-term governance. The human cost of this dynastic instability is difficult to exaggerate. The sagas recount, in terse, matter-of-fact prose, the murders of Jarls by their own brothers, the burning of rival claimants in their halls, and the poisoning, strangling, and stabbing of inconvenient relatives. The Jarl's family was the most dangerous place in Orkney, and the life expectancy of a claimant to the earldom was shockingly short. The women of the dynasty, though often portrayed as passive victims or scheming villains, played a crucial role in the political game, their marriages serving to cement alliances between rival branches of the family or between the earldom and foreign powers. Ragnhild, the Scottish princess who married 3 successive Orkney Jarls and allegedly murdered 2 of them, is the most notorious of these women, but she was far from alone. The sagas also mention women who acted as power brokers, regents, and patrons of the church, using their wealth and influence to shape the political destiny of the earldom. The dynastic history of Orkney is, therefore, not only a story of male violence but also a story of female agency, exercised within the constraints of a patriarchal society but nonetheless real and consequential. The relationship between the Orkney Jarls and the Norwegian crown added another layer of complexity to the earldom's dynastic politics. The kings of Norway claimed the right to confirm the appointment of the Jarls and to intervene in succession disputes, and they periodically exercised this right by dispatching fleets to Orkney to impose their preferred candidate or to collect overdue tribute. The Jarls, for their part, sought to maximize their autonomy by playing the Norwegian kings against the Scottish kings, the Irish kings, and the rival factions within the earldom itself. The saga recounts numerous occasions on which an Orkney Jarl traveled to Norway to pay homage to the king and was rewarded with a renewed grant of the earldom, only to return to Orkney and resume his independent ways. This game of cat and mouse between crown and earldom was a constant feature of Orkney's political life, and it produced some of the most dramatic episodes in the saga, including the confrontation between Thorfinn the Mighty and Harald Hardrada that we have already described. The ultimate failure of the Norwegian crown to assert effective control over Orkney was due not to any lack of ambition but to the sheer logistical difficulty of projecting power across the North Sea, a difficulty that the Jarls exploited with consummate skill. The political geography of the earldom also contributed to its dynastic instability, because the earldom was not a compact, easily governed territory but a scattered collection of islands and mainland provinces, each with its own local interests and loyalties. Caithness, the mainland province across the Pentland Firth, was a particularly troublesome possession, because its population was mixed Norse and Gaelic, and its chieftains were often more responsive to the Scottish crown than to the Jarl of Orkney. The Hebrides and the other western territories were even more difficult to control, lying as they did at the opposite end of a long and exposed sea route, and the Jarls who attempted to hold these lands often found themselves overstretched, forced to fight on multiple fronts against enemies who could strike from any direction. The dynastic conflicts that racked the earldom were thus exacerbated by the centrifugal forces inherent in its geography, forces that pulled the earldom apart and made it difficult for any single ruler to impose his will on the whole. The earldom of Orkney was, in this sense, a victim of its own success. The very expansion that had made it powerful also made it ungovernable. The later history of the earldom, in the 12th and 13th centuries, saw a gradual shift away from the pattern of divided inheritance toward a more stable, unitary succession, a shift that was driven in part by the influence of the Church, which favored primogeniture as a means of preserving the integrity of ecclesiastical endowments. The rise of the saintly figure of Magnus Erlendsson, who was murdered by his cousin in 1117 and later canonized, was a turning point in this process, because the cult of Saint Magnus provided a unifying focus for Orkney society and a model of peaceful, Christian rulership that contrasted with the violent ethos of the old pagan Jarls. The construction of the great cathedral at Kirkwall, dedicated to Saint Magnus, was a statement of the new order, a physical monument to the triumph of Christian kingship over dynastic chaos. Yet the old patterns of violence and division were never entirely eradicated, and the earldom continued to experience periodic outbreaks of civil war until its final absorption into the Scottish kingdom in the 15th century. The dynastic history of Orkney is, in the end, a cautionary tale about the limits of personal ambition, the corrosive effects of divided authority, and the blood price of power in a world where the sword was the ultimate arbiter of succession. The expansion of the Orkney earldom beyond the islands themselves and onto the Scottish mainland, into the Hebrides, and across the Irish Sea was one of the defining achievements of the Jarls, and it transformed the earldom from a local power into a regional hegemony that rivaled the established kingdoms of the North Atlantic. The process of expansion began with Sigurd the Mighty in the late 9th century, who conquered Caithness and Sutherland, and it continued under his successors, who pushed the boundaries of the earldom southward into Ross and Moray, westward into the Hebrides, and, at times, into the northern parts of Ireland. The driving force behind this expansion was a combination of factors: the need for more land to support a growing population, the desire for the plunder and tribute that could be extracted from conquered territories, and the strategic imperative of controlling the sea lanes that passed through the waters around Orkney. The expansion was not, however, a one-way process of Norse conquest. It involved complex interactions with the existing populations, the forging of alliances with local chieftains, and the absorption of Gaelic and Pictish influences into the Orkney Norse culture. The earldom that emerged from this process was a hybrid entity, part Norse, part Gaelic, part Pictish, and its very hybridity was a source of both strength and tension. The conquest and consolidation of Caithness was the most enduring of Orkney's mainland acquisitions, and it created a political entity that straddled the Penland Firth and linked the islands to the Scottish mainland in a permanent union. The Norse settlement of Caithness was intensive, as evidenced by the density of Norse place names in the county. Over 200 farm names of Norse origin have been identified in Caithness, including such characteristic forms as stir, from Old Norse, stair, meaning farm, and stir, from bostar, meaning homestead. The indigenous Gaelic population was not expelled but was gradually absorbed into the Norse social and economic system, and the resulting population was a mix of Norse and Gaelic elements, with the Norse language and culture predominating in the coastal areas and the Gaelic culture persisting in the interior. The Jarls of Orkney ruled Caithness through a combination of direct administration, delegation to local chieftains, and periodic shows of military force, and the relationship between the Jarls and the Scottish crown was an ongoing source of friction. The Scottish kings, from the time of Malcolm II onward, claimed sovereignty over Caithness, and the history of the province is a record of alternating conflict and compromise between the two powers. The western expansion of the earldom into the Hebrides and the islands of the Irish Sea was a more sporadic and less successful enterprise, because these regions were already densely settled by Norse and Gaelic populations who fiercely resisted outside control. The Hebrides, known to the Norse as the Shurijar, or Southern Isles, were a patchwork of small kingdoms and chieftaincies that had been colonized by Vikings in the 9th century and that had developed their own distinctive culture, a fusion of Norse and Gaelic that was similar to that of Orkney but even more heavily Gaelicized. The Jarls of Orkney, from Sigurd the Stout to Thorfinn the Mighty, periodically claimed overlordship of the Hebrides and exacted tribute from their chieftains, but the grip of Orkney on the islands was always tenuous and frequently contested by the kings of Norway, the kings of the Isles, and the rising power of the Kingdom of the Isles under rulers like Somerled and his descendants. The Orkneyinga Saga's claims of Hebridean conquest are best understood as expressions of the Jarls' ambitions rather than as accurate records of sustained control. The reality was a shifting pattern of alliances, raids, and temporary submissions that rarely amounted to stable rule. The involvement of the Orkney Jarls in the affairs of Ireland was, for the most part, limited to the provision of ships and warriors to the Norse kings of Dublin and the participation in specific campaigns, such as the Battle of Clontarf. Ireland, with its rich monasteries, fertile lands, and fragmented political landscape, had been a prime target for Viking raiders since the late 8th century, and the Norse enclaves at Dublin, Limerick, Waterford, and Wexford had grown into powerful city-states that were deeply entangled in the politics of the island. The Orkney Jarls, with their substantial naval resources, were valuable allies to the Dublin Norse, and Sigurd the Stout's decision to fight at Clontarf was a strategic calculation that reflected the earldom's integration into the wider Viking world. The death of Sigurd at Clontarf, however, marked the effective end of Orkney's direct military involvement in Ireland. After 1014, the earldom's focus shifted increasingly to the Scottish mainland and the northern seas, and the Irish connection, while it never entirely faded, became a matter of trade and cultural exchange rather than military adventure. The legacy of the earldom's expansion is written in the ethnic and cultural landscape of northern Scotland, where the Norse influence is still palpable in the place names, the dialects, and the genetic makeup of the population. The county of Caithness, in particular, retains a strong Norse identity, and its people have historically distinguished themselves from the Gaelic Highlanders to the south, a distinction that is rooted in the centuries of Norse rule. The same is true, to a lesser extent, of Sutherland and the Orkney Islands themselves, where the Norse heritage is celebrated as a core component of local identity. The expansion of the earldom was, therefore, not merely a military and political phenomenon but a demographic and cultural one, an expansion that left a permanent mark on the map of Britain and that shaped the identities of the communities that live in the northern fringe to this day. The earldom of Orkney, at its height, was a multi-ethnic, multilingual polity that encompassed a remarkable diversity of peoples and traditions, and its history is a testament to the capacity of the Norse diaspora to adapt, integrate, and in the end, be transformed by the societies they had conquered. The death of Thorfinn the Mighty around 1065 brought to an end the greatest period of the Orkney earldom's power and initiated a slow, uneven decline that would culminate, over the course of the next 2 centuries, in the loss of the earldom's independence and its absorption into the emerging kingdom of Scotland. The immediate successors of Thorfinn, his sons Paul and Erland, ruled jointly for a time, but their relationship was strained, and the earldom was drawn into the wider conflicts that were reshaping the North Atlantic world in the late 11th and early 12th centuries. The Norman conquest of England in 1066, the death of Harold Hardrada at Stamford Bridge that same year, and the ongoing struggles between the Scottish and Norwegian crowns for control of the northern territories created a volatile strategic environment in which the earldom, no longer under the protection of a strong jarl, became increasingly vulnerable to external pressure. Paul and Erland eventually fell out, and their sons, Håkon Paulson and Magnus Erlandsson, became the central figures in a dynastic drama that would produce one of the most enduring symbols of Orkney's Christianization, the martyrdom of Saint Magnus. Magnus Erlandsson, known to history as Saint Magnus of Orkney, was a figure whose life and death encapsulate the tensions of the late earldom period, the clash between the old warrior ethos and the new Christian piety, the conflict between dynastic rivals, and the relationship between the earldom and the Norwegian crown. According to the Orkneyinga Saga, Magnus was a gentle, pious man who was forced against his will into the violent world of Orkney politics. When his cousin Håkon Pálsson seized power and demanded that Magnus share the earldom with him, Magnus agreed, but the co-rule quickly broke down, and Håkon plotted to eliminate his rival. In 1117, the two men met on the island of Egilsey to negotiate a settlement, but Håkon, in flagrant violation of the peace oath he had sworn, ordered Magnus to be killed. The saga records that Magnus accepted his fate with Christian resignation, praying for his executioners and asking that he be killed with a single blow to the head, rather than beheaded like a criminal. The blow was delivered by Håkon's cook, Lifalf, who struck Magnus on the skull with an axe, killing him instantly. Magnus was buried at the church on Egilsey, and reports of miracles soon began to circulate, leading to his canonization and the eventual translation of his relics to the newly built cathedral in Kirkwall. The cult of Saint Magnus grew rapidly in the 12th century, and the cathedral that was built to house his remains became one of the most important pilgrimage sites in the Norse world. The cathedral, dedicated to Saint Magnus and constructed from local red sandstone, was begun in 1137 under the patronage of the Jarl Ragnvald Kalli Kolsson, a descendant of both the Paul and Erland lines who had spent time in Norway and who was himself a poet, adventurer, and crusader. Ragnvald's construction of the cathedral was a political as well as a religious act, intended to legitimize his rule by associating it with the saintly martyr and to provide a focal point for Orkney's Christian identity. The building, which still dominates the skyline of Kirkwall, is a masterpiece of Romanesque architecture, with its massive round arches, its richly carved doorways, and its soaring central tower. The relics of Saint Magnus, enclosed in a silver shrine on the high altar, attracted pilgrims from across the North Atlantic, and the revenues from the pilgrimage trade contributed to the prosperity of the cathedral and the town. The martyrdom of Magnus, and the cult that grew up around him, represented a decisive shift in the values of Orkney society, away from the glorification of violence, and toward the ideal of Christian sacrifice and forgiveness. The later 12th and 13th centuries saw the earldom gradually drawn into the orbit of the Scottish kingdom, a process that was driven by the decline of Norwegian power in the region, the growing influence of the Scottish Church, and the increasing economic integration of the northern territories with the Scottish mainland. The Norwegian crown, which had always claimed sovereignty over Orkney and Shetland, continued to appoint jarls and collect tribute throughout the 12th century, but its ability to enforce its authority waned as Norway itself was torn by civil war and the center of Norse power shifted westward, toward Iceland and Greenland. The Scottish kings, particularly William I, the Lion, and Alexander II, aggressively asserted their claims to Caithness and Sutherland, and the Jarls of Orkney, caught between the two powers, often found themselves forced to acknowledge the overlordship of both, paying tribute to Norway while also swearing fealty to Scotland for their mainland possessions. This dual allegiance, though politically expedient, was inherently unstable, and it created a permanent state of uncertainty that undermined the earldom's cohesion. The final blow to the earldom's independence came in the late 13th century, with the Treaty of Perth in 1266, which ended the long-running conflict between Norway and Scotland over the Hebrides and the Western Islands. Under the terms of the treaty, Norway ceded the Hebrides and the Isle of Man to Scotland in return for a cash payment and a promise of continued Norwegian sovereignty over Orkney and Shetland. The treaty, however, was a temporary reprieve rather than a permanent solution, and the weakness of the Norwegian kingdom in the following century made it increasingly difficult for Norway to defend its interests in the north. The earldom itself passed, through a series of marriages and inheritance, into the hands of the Sinclair family, a powerful Anglo-Norman dynasty that had close ties to the Scottish crown. The Sinclairs, who ruled Orkney from the late 14th century, were effectively independent princes, but their ambitions were focused on the Scottish court rather than on the maintenance of Orkney's Norse heritage. The final transfer of Orkney and Shetland to Scotland came in 1468–69, when the islands were pledged as security for the dowry of Margaret of Denmark, the bride of King James III of Scotland. The dowry was never paid, and the islands became permanently part of the Scottish kingdom, ending over 500 years of Norse sovereignty. The legacy of the earldom, however, did not die with its political extinction. The institutions, laws, and customs that the Norse had brought to Orkney endured for centuries, and they continue to shape the identity of the islands to this day. The odal system of land tenure, which had been the bedrock of the free farmers' independence, remained in force until the 17th century, and the Norse dialect, though gradually replaced by Scots, left a deep imprint on the Arcadian language. The Cathedral of St. Magnus, the runic inscriptions at Maeshowe, and the thousands of Norse place names that cover the map of Orkney are the visible reminders of the centuries when the islands were the center of a maritime empire. The Orkneyinga Saga, composed in far-off Iceland, remains the definitive literary monument to the earldom, preserving the memory of the Jarls and their deeds for future generations. The decline of the earldom was a slow, complex process, driven by forces that were beyond the control of any individual Jarl: the rise of the Scottish state, the waning of Norwegian power, the transformation of the North Atlantic economy, and the shifting tides of climate and demography. But the story of Orkney is not, in the end, a story of decline. It is a story of resilience, adaptation, and the enduring power of a small island community to shape its own destiny against the odds. The cultural and genetic legacy of the Orkney earldom is a living reality that continues to shape the identity of the islands and their people, long after the last Norse Jarl has been forgotten by all but the historians. The modern Arcadian population carries within its genome the traces of the Norse Pictish encounter, a biological record of the migrations and intermarriages that occurred over 1,000 years ago. Studies of the Y chromosome, which is passed from father to son, have shown that the paternal lineages of Orkney are predominantly of Scandinavian origin, with a high frequency of the haplogroup R1a, a genetic marker that is common in Norway and that distinguishes the Norse-descended populations of the North Atlantic from the more heavily Celtic populations of the British mainland. The mitochondrial DNA, which is passed from mother to child, tells a more complex story, with a significant proportion of the maternal lineages originating from the indigenous Pictish and Gaelic populations, confirming the pattern, familiar from Iceland and the Faroes, of Norse men taking wives and concubines from the local population. The genetic evidence thus corroborates the historical and archaeological record, painting a picture of a society in which the male line was predominantly Norse but the female line was a mixture of Norse, Pictish, and Gaelic, a fusion that produced the distinctive Arcadian population that we see today. The linguistic heritage of the Norse period is equally significant, and it is one of the most accessible ways in which the modern visitor can connect with the earldom's past. The Norse language, known in its local form as Norn, was spoken in Orkney and Shetland for centuries after the islands passed to Scotland, and it only gradually died out, replaced by Scots, in the 17th and 18th centuries. The last native speaker of Norn in Orkney, a man named Walter Sutherland, died on the island of Unston, Shetland around 1850, but the language left behind a rich deposit of vocabulary, place names, and expressions that are still used by Arcadians today. Words like clap shot, a traditional dish of mashed turnips and potatoes, roost, a tidal race, vor, spring, and har, sea mist, all derive from Norn, and they reflect the deep connection between the language and the maritime environment. The place names of Orkney, as we have already noted, are overwhelmingly Norse in origin, and they provide a detailed map of the landscape as the Norse saw it: the farm, Bister, the headland, Ness, the bay, Wick, the island, and the many other features that make up the archipelago. The Arcadian dialect of Scots, with its distinctive sing-song intonation and its Norse vocabulary, is one of the most important living legacies of the earldom. The material culture of the earldom, preserved in museums and archaeological sites across the islands, provides a tangible connection to the past. The National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh and the Orkney Museum in Kirkwall house collections of Viking Age artifacts that include weapons, jewelry, tools, and everyday objects that bring the world of the sagas to life. The Brough of Birsay, the seat of the earldom during the reign of Thorfinn the Mighty, is a site of pilgrimage for history enthusiasts, who can walk among the excavated ruins of the Jarl's Hall and the church he built, standing on the same ground where the great Jarl once held court. The Cathedral of St. Magnus in Kirkwall, a masterpiece of Romanesque architecture, continues to serve as a place of worship and as a monument to the earldom's Christian faith, its red sandstone walls glowing in the low northern light. The archaeological sites at Jarlshof in Shetland and the Brough of Deerness in Orkney reveal the domestic life of the Norse settlers, their longhouses with their central hearths, their byres and barns, and their workshops where they crafted the tools and weapons that sustained their way of life. These sites are not just historical monuments. They are the physical remains of a civilization that once ruled these seas. The folk traditions and folklore of Orkney preserve the memory of the earldom in a more intangible but equally powerful form. The stories that are told in the islands today, of Selkies, Seal People, Trolls, and the hidden folk, have roots that stretch back to the Norse period, when the boundary between the natural and the supernatural was a porous one. The festival of Uphellier, celebrated in Shetland rather than Orkney, with its burning longship and its torch-bearing guisers, is a modern reinvention of Viking tradition, but it reflects a deep cultural memory that is shared by the entire Norse North Atlantic. In Orkney itself, the midsummer bonfires, the storytelling traditions, and the deep attachment to the sea all speak to a continuity of culture that has survived the centuries. The Orkneyinga Saga is still read aloud in some households, and the names of the Jarls, Sigurd, Thorfinn, Magnus, are still given to children, keeping the memory of the earldom alive in the most personal way possible. The Orkney earldom, as a historical phenomenon, was a product of its time, a violent, ambitious, and often brutal polity that was typical of the Viking Age in its methods and its values. But it was also something more, a unique fusion of Norse and Celtic cultures, a maritime empire that punched far above its weight, and a laboratory of political and social experimentation that produced some of the most compelling characters and stories of the medieval world. The legacy of the earldom is not just the ruins and the artifacts, the place names and the genes, but the idea of Orkney itself, an idea of a place apart, a sea-girt land whose people have always been shaped by the ocean that surrounds them. The earldom is gone, but its spirit endures, in the salt air, and the grey seas and the fierce independence of the Arcadian people, who still, after 1,000 years, look to the horizon with the same mixture of wariness and hope that the first Norse settlers must have felt when they sailed their longships into the unknown waters of the north. The 13th century dawned over an Orkney earldom that was still nominally Norse, still proud, but increasingly caught in the tightening grip of a transformed political landscape. The Treaty of Perth in 1266, signed between King Magnus VI of Norway and King Alexander III of Scotland, formally ended the Norwegian claim to the Hebrides and the Isle of Man in exchange for a substantial payment of 4,000 marks of silver and an annual perpetual payment of 100 marks. Crucially, however, Norway explicitly retained its sovereignty over Orkney and Shetland. This was not a gesture of affection but a hard-nosed strategic calculation. The Norwegian crown recognized that Orkney, sitting astride the vital sea lanes, remained a key to any residual influence in the British Isles. The earldom, now held by a line of Jarls increasingly tied to Scottish aristocratic families through marriage, became a curious hybrid, a Norwegian territory governed by men whose lands, ambitions, and kin were predominantly Scottish. The Jarls navigated this dual loyalty with the practiced ambiguity of seasoned politicians, swearing fealty to the Norwegian king in Bergen while simultaneously holding vast estates under the Scottish crown in Caithness and Sutherland. This balancing act worked because both distant monarchs found it convenient. The Norwegian king collected his tribute without the expense of administering the islands, and the Scottish king enjoyed a buffer zone to his north without having to directly confront his Norwegian counterpart. The islands themselves, however, began to drift, culturally and economically, out of the Norse orbit and into the Scottish sphere, a slow, silent transformation that was as irreversible as the tide. The economic underpinnings of the earldom during this late period reflected the broader commercial shifts of the medieval world. The dried fish and wool that had been the staples of Orkney's export economy for centuries remained important, but new commodities and new routes began to emerge. The German Hanseatic League, a powerful commercial confederation of merchant guilds and market towns, extended its reach into the North Atlantic, and Bergen, the Norwegian port that had long been Orkney's primary trading partner, became a Hanseatic contour, or trading post. The Hansa merchants, with their efficient ships and sophisticated credit networks, began to dominate the trade in stockfish and other bulk goods, and Orkney's producers found themselves integrated into a continental commercial system that stretched from the Baltic to the Mediterranean. The impact on Orkney was mixed. On the one hand, it brought access to a wider range of imported goods, including German beer, Rhenish wine, fine cloth, and iron tools. On the other hand, it eroded the independence of the local merchants, who were increasingly reduced to the role of middlemen between the foreign buyers and the island producers. The Jarls, whose revenues depended heavily on the tolls and taxes of trade, profited from the increased volume of commerce, but the relationship was a dependent one, and the earldom was no longer the master of its own economic destiny. The old maritime routes that had radiated from Orkney to Iceland, Ireland, and the Hebrides were gradually eclipsed by the new Hanseatic highways, and the island's strategic importance, while still significant, was no longer the unassailable asset it had been. The structure of landholding and society in the earldom also began to evolve in ways that undermined the traditional Norse freedoms. The Odel system, which had guaranteed the free farmers their hereditary rights to the land, came under pressure from the Jarls and their Scottish allies, who sought to convert the allodial holdings into feudal tenures that would give the lord greater control over the land and its occupants. This process, known as feudalization, was a slow and contested one, resisted fiercely by the Orkney farmers who saw their ancient liberties slipping away. The Church, particularly the powerful bishops of Orkney, played a role in this transformation, acquiring vast estates that were organized along feudal lines and that were worked by tenants who owed rents and services to the bishop rather than to the Jarl. The rise of the Church as a major landholder introduced a new element into the island's politics, creating a triangular struggle for power among the Jarl, the bishop, and the Bandi. The Orkneyinga Saga, with its tales of bold Jarls and independent farmers, was already becoming a nostalgic memory of a world that was passing away, replaced by a more rigid, hierarchical society in which the old freedoms were being eroded by parchment, law, and the relentless logic of feudal obligation. The succession of Jarls in the 13th and early 14th centuries became a tangled web of Scottish and Scandinavian claims, marriages, and occasional assassinations. The line of the Norse Jarls, descendants of the original Earls of Moor, gradually petered out, and the earldom passed into the hands of the Angus family, a powerful Scottish noble house with extensive lands in Angus and the Lothians. The Angus Jarls, while they respected the nominal sovereignty of Norway, were fundamentally Scottish magnates, and their primary interests lay in the politics of the Scottish court rather than in the traditions of the Norse earldom. The death of Earl John of Orkney in 1312 without male heirs opened the door for a new family to claim the earldom, the Sinclairs, or Street Clares, a Norman-derived family that had risen to prominence in Scotland through royal service and advantageous marriages. The Sinclairs would rule Orkney for over 100 years, and their tenure marked the final phase of the earldom's history as a distinct political entity. The Sinclairs were builders and administrators rather than Viking warriors. They constructed the magnificent castle at Kirkwall and the collegiate church at Rosslyn, and they governed their island domain with a mix of feudal rigor and pragmatic tolerance. Under the Sinclairs, the earldom became a quiet, prosperous backwater, its days of Norse glory fading into the mists of memory. The cultural transformation of the islands during this period was profound. The Norse language, Norn, which had been the everyday speech of the islands for half a millennium, began its slow retreat before the advancing tide of Scots, the Germanic language of the Scottish lowlands that was becoming the dominant tongue of trade, law, and administration throughout the kingdom. The process was gradual, and Norn survived as a household language in the more remote islands and districts for centuries, but the shift was inexorable. The adoption of Scots brought with it a broader cultural reorientation, as Arcadians began to identify more closely with the Scottish nation and its traditions, while still retaining a strong sense of their distinctive island identity. The Old Norse sagas, once told around the winter hearths, gave way to the ballads and folk tales of the Scottish tradition, and the names of the heroes changed from Sigurd and Thorfinn to Wallace and Bruce. Yet, beneath the surface, the Norse heritage persisted, in the cadence of the spoken word, in the names of the farms and the bays, and in the deep, enduring connection to the sea that had defined the islands since the first longships breasted the waves. Orkney was becoming Scottish, but it was a Scottishness that was uniquely Arcadian, a hybrid identity forged in the crucible of the earldom's long and violent history. The year 1468 is the pivot on which the entire history of Orkney turns, the moment when the islands were severed from their Scandinavian roots and irrevocably bound to the Scottish crown. The circumstances of this transfer were, on the surface, purely dynastic. King Christian I of Denmark, who also ruled Norway and Sweden in the fragile Kalmar Union, needed to provide a dowry for his daughter Margaret, who was betrothed to the young King James III of Scotland. The agreed dowry was 60,000 florins, an enormous sum that Christian could not pay in cash. Instead, Christian pledged Orkney as security for the payment, transferring the islands to the Scottish crown until the debt was redeemed. The Shetland Islands were pledged the following year for an additional 8,000 florins. The pledge was never redeemed, and the islands became, in effect, part of Scotland. In 1471, the Scottish Parliament formally annexed Orkney and Shetland to the crown, extinguishing the rights of the Norwegian king and, with them, the last legal vestiges of the Norse earldom. The transfer was accomplished not through a bloody conquest but through the quiet instruments of royal marriage and international finance, and it was all the more effective for its lack of drama. The Jarls of Orkney, the Sinclairs, remained in place as the king's lieutenants, but their power was now derived from the Scottish crown, not from the Norwegian, and they were required to surrender the earldom to the king in return for other lands and titles. The transformation was complete. Orkney was no longer a Norse earldom, but a Scottish lordship, and its long, proud history as an independent maritime power came to a quiet, unheralded end. The immediate consequences of the transfer were less dramatic than one might expect. The legal system of the islands remained largely intact, with the Old Norse laws, the Udal law, as it came to be known in Scots, continuing to govern matters of land tenure, inheritance, and maritime rights. The Scots administration, recognizing the uniqueness of the Orkney situation, wisely chose not to impose an alien legal framework on a population that was fiercely attached to its traditions. The Udal law, with its guarantee of allodial ownership and its prohibition on feudal superiors, survived as a distinct legal tradition within the Scottish realm, a living fossil of the Norse age that would persist until the 17th century and, in some respects, into the modern era. The Church, too, continued its work, and the bishops of Orkney, now appointed by the Scottish crown, maintained the Cathedral of St. Magnus and the network of parish churches that served the scattered communities of the islands. The transition, in institutional terms, was smooth, and the ordinary people of Orkney continued to fish, farm, and trade much as they had before, their lives governed by the rhythms of the seasons and the sea rather than by the distant machinations of kings and parliaments. The long-term consequences of the transfer, however, were profound and far-reaching. The integration of Orkney into the Scottish kingdom brought the islands into the maelstrom of Scottish politics, with its factional rivalries, religious conflicts, and ultimately, the long, bloody saga of the union with England. The Reformation of the 16th century, which swept away the old Catholic Church and replaced it with a Presbyterian establishment, came to Orkney in the 1560s, bringing with it a profound transformation of religious life. The Cathedral of St. Magnus, which had been the seat of the Catholic bishops, was stripped of its altars, its statues, and its relics, and became a parish church of the Reformed faith, its medieval splendor replaced by the austere simplicity of Calvinist worship. The monasteries and religious houses that had dotted the islands were dissolved, their lands seized by the crown, and sold to the rising class of Scottish lairds who were the agents of the new order. The Sinclair Earls, who had converted to Protestantism, navigated the turbulent waters of the Reformation with skill, retaining their influence and their estates. But the old church, which had been one of the pillars of the earldom's identity, was gone, replaced by a new religious dispensation that was alien to the Norse past. The economic impact of the Scottish takeover was mixed. The Hanseatic trade, which had been so important to the earldom's prosperity, declined in the 16th century as the Scottish merchants of the East Coast ports, particularly Edinburgh, Dundee, and Aberdeen, asserted their control over the commerce of the North Sea. Orkney's trade was increasingly channeled through these Scottish ports, and the islands became suppliers of raw materials, fish, wool, hides, to the merchants of the mainland, who took the lion's share of the profits. The old economic independence, in which the Orkney merchants had sailed their own ships to foreign markets, was gradually lost, replaced by a dependent relationship that mirrored the island's political subordination. However, the growth of the British state in the 18th and 19th centuries, and the emergence of the Royal Navy's base at Scapa Flow, brought new economic opportunities and a new strategic significance to the islands. Scapa Flow, the great natural harbor in the heart of the Orkney archipelago, became the main anchorage of the British Grand Fleet during the First World War, and the islands were transformed by the influx of thousands of sailors, soldiers, and construction workers. The naval base brought employment, infrastructure, and a renewed sense of connection to the wider world, but it also brought the islands into the front line of global conflict, a position that would have fateful consequences. The Scottish takeover of Orkney did not erase the island's Norse heritage. It submerged it, like a sunken longship, beneath the layers of subsequent history. The Arcadians remained a distinct people, with their own dialect, their own customs, and a fierce pride in their island's history. The tales of the Jarls, preserved in the Orkneyinga Saga and in the oral tradition, continued to be told, and the names of Sigurd, Thorfinn, and Magnus were invoked as symbols of a golden age when Orkney was a power in its own right. The Norse heritage became a touchstone of Arcadian identity, a way of distinguishing the islands from the Scottish mainland and asserting a unique place within the British Isles. The transfer of 1468 was, in a sense, the end of the earldom, but it was also the beginning of a new chapter, in which the memory of the earldom would be reinterpreted and reinvented by successive generations, shaped to meet the needs of the present while remaining rooted in the deep soil of the past. The survival of the Norse legal and cultural traditions in Orkney after the Scottish takeover is one of the most remarkable stories of institutional persistence in the medieval world. The Udal law, as it was called in the Scots dialect from the Old Norse, al, meaning ancestral property, continued to govern land tenure in the islands for centuries after the annexation of 1471. Under Udal law, land was owned outright by the individual, who could pass it on to his descendants without the intervention of a feudal superior. This was in stark contrast to the feudal system that prevailed in Scotland, where all land was ultimately held from the crown through a hierarchy of lords and vassals. The clash between Udal and feudal law was a constant feature of Orkney's legal history in the early modern period, as the Scottish crown and the local lairds sought to impose feudal tenures on the islands, while the Orkney farmers fought to retain their ancient rights. The courts were filled with cases that turned on the interpretation of these two incompatible systems, and the judges, often unfamiliar with Norse law, struggled to apply precedents that stretched back to the Viking Age. The Udal law was never formally abolished, and its principles survived, in a modified form, well into the 19th century, when the great land reforms of the Victorian era finally brought the Orkney land system into line with the rest of Scotland. The language, too, refused to die easily. Norn, the Norse dialect of Orkney and Shetland, was still widely spoken in the islands in the 16th and 17th centuries, particularly in the more isolated communities where the influence of Scots was weak. The earliest written records of Norn are fragmentary, consisting mainly of a few runic inscriptions and occasional words and phrases recorded by visiting scholars. The Lord's Prayer in Norn, transcribed by the antiquary James Wallace in the 1690s, is one of the longest surviving texts in the language, and it reveals a dialect that had diverged significantly from Old Norse but was still recognizably Scandinavian in its grammar and vocabulary. The decline of Norn accelerated in the 18th century as the Scottish Church and the Scottish school system, both of which used English and Scots as their media of instruction, extended their reach into the most remote corners of the islands. The last speakers of Norn were elderly men and women in the early 19th century, and by the time of the 1851 census, the language was effectively extinct, though its influence on the local Scots dialect was profound and enduring. The loss of Norn was a cultural tragedy, the severing of a direct linguistic link to the earldom and to the Norse world, and it is a loss that is still mourned by those who cherish Orkney's unique heritage. The folk culture of Orkney preserved the memory of the Norse past in ways that were less tangible than laws or languages but no less significant. The stories of the Selkies, the seal people who could shed their skins and become human, are found throughout the North Atlantic, but in Orkney, they are told with a particular intensity and a particular connection to the sea. The Selkie legends, with their themes of transformation, loss, and the irresistible pull of the ocean, can be read as allegories for the human experience of the islands, a place where the boundary between land and sea is always shifting and where the past is never far below the surface. The Tros, or Trolls, of Orkney folklore are descendants of the Norse Troll, and the stories of their mischief and malice are a direct inheritance from the pagan beliefs of the Viking settlers. The midsummer bonfires, which were lit on the hilltops of Orkney until the 19th century, may have been a continuation of the Norse Salvarf celebration, a ritual marking the turning of the sun that was later Christianized as the Feast of St. John. The folk music of the islands, with its distinctive rhythms and its haunting melodies, incorporates elements that may have been brought by the Norse, though the evidence is, inevitably, fragmentary. The material legacy of the earldom is everywhere visible in the Orkney landscape, from the great cathedral of St. Magnus in Kirkwall to the humblest farmstead. The archaeological record continues to yield new treasures, deepening our understanding of the Norse period and its aftermath. The excavations at the Brough of Birsay, which began in the 1970s and continue to this day, have uncovered not only the remains of the Jarls Hall and the church but also a rich array of everyday objects, spindle whorls, fishing hooks, bone pins, pottery, that illuminate the lives of the ordinary people who lived in the shadow of the earldom. The discovery in 2005 of a Viking Age boat burial at Skara, on the island of Sandy, with its 3 occupants, and its rich grave goods, was a reminder that the soil of Orkney still holds secrets that can transform our understanding of the past. The runic inscriptions at Maeshowe, carved by Norse visitors in the 12th century, are a unique window into the minds of the people who lived in the earldom, their jokes, their prayers, and their boasts preserved in the cold stone for posterity. The Ness of Brough, the vast Neolithic complex that has been under excavation since 2004, has pushed the story of Orkney back into the deep past, reminding us that the Norse were only the latest in a long succession of peoples who have made these islands their home. The cultural memory of the earldom has been a powerful force in the construction of modern Arcadian identity. The Orkneyinga Saga, which was little known outside academic circles for centuries, was rediscovered by the Scottish literary world in the 19th century and translated into English for the first time in 1873 by Joseph Anderson. The saga captured the imagination of a public that was hungry for tales of the Viking past, and it became a foundational text for the modern understanding of Orkney's history. The saga has since been translated into many languages, and it is now a staple of the tourist industry, its stories of jarls and battles, saints and sinners, retold in guidebooks, museum exhibits, and heritage trails. The saga has also inspired a new wave of creative work, from novels and poems to plays and musical compositions, that reinterprets the earldom for the modern age. The legacy of the earldom is, therefore, not a dead thing, a relic of a bygone age, but a living tradition that continues to evolve and to inspire. The people of Orkney, who have inherited this legacy, are its custodians, and their stewardship of the island's history is a vital part of the cultural life of the nation. The Reformation, which swept across Scotland in the 1560s, brought a religious revolution to Orkney that was as profound in its impact as the Norse conversion to Christianity had been 5 centuries earlier. The old Catholic establishment, which had been centered on the Cathedral of St. Magnus and the Bishopric of Orkney, was swept away, its institutions dissolved, and its wealth confiscated by the Crown and the rising class of Protestant lairds. The last Catholic Bishop of Orkney, Adam Bothwell, a man of flexible conscience, conformed to the new order and was appointed as a Protestant superintendent, an act of political survival that allowed the diocesan structure to continue in a modified form. The cathedral, stripped of its altars, its statues, and the silver shrine that had held the relics of St. Magnus, became a parish church of the Reformed Church of Scotland, its rituals simplified, its clergy reduced in number, and its revenues diverted to the Crown. The physical fabric of the church buildings across the islands suffered accordingly, many were allowed to fall into disrepair, their roofs leaking, their walls crumbling, as the new church lacked the resources and, in some cases, the will to maintain the medieval inheritance. The round-towered church at Egilsey, where St. Magnus had been martyred, was abandoned and became a roofless ruin, a poignant symbol of the rupture with the past. The impact of the Reformation on the ordinary people of Orkney was complex and varied. The islands, like much of the Highlands and Islands of Scotland, were conservative in their religious sensibilities, and the new Protestant doctrines were not universally welcomed. The old Catholic practices, the veneration of saints, the pilgrimage to holy wells, the use of rosaries and crucifixes, died hard, and the church authorities were forced to contend with a population that was attached to the traditional forms of piety. The local lairds, who had benefited from the seizure of church lands, were often less zealous in enforcing the new orthodoxy than the ministers appointed by the General Assembly, leading to tensions within the parish communities. Over time, however, the Reformed faith took root, and Orkney became a stronghold of Presbyterianism, its people noted for their strict Sabbatarianism, their love of the metrical psalms, and their deep suspicion of the Episcopal and Catholic traditions that persisted elsewhere in Scotland. The church became the center of social and cultural life in the islands, its ministers the most educated and influential members of the community, its discipline the framework within which the moral life of the people was ordered. The Sinclair Earls, who had ruled Orkney since the late 14th century, navigated the treacherous waters of the Reformation with the same pragmatism that had characterized their ancestors. The Sinclairs were early converts to Protestantism, aligning themselves with the powerful Protestant faction in Scottish politics and ensuring that their lands and titles were secured under the new dispensation. The most famous of the Sinclair Earls, William Sinclair, the third Earl, was a man of the Renaissance rather than the Reformation, a patron of arts and letters who built the magnificent Rosslyn Chapel near Edinburgh, with its intricate carvings that blend Christian and pagan symbolism in a manner that is strikingly reminiscent of the syncretic art of the Norse period. The Sinclairs, however, were gradually losing their grip on the islands. The earldom was formally surrendered to the crown in 1614, and the Sinclairs were compensated with lands and titles in Scotland proper. Orkney passed into the hands of a series of royal favourites and absentee landlords who had little connection to the islands, and who viewed them primarily as a source of revenue. The departure of the Sinclairs marked the end of the old earldom in more than a legal sense. It severed the personal link between the ruler and the ruled that had been a defining feature of Orkney politics since the time of Sigurd the Mighty. The economic and social history of Orkney in the early modern period was marked by the same forces that were reshaping the rest of Scotland: the growth of a commercial economy, the enclosure of common lands, the rise of the laird class, and the slow but steady integration into the British state. The traditional system of subsistence farming, supplemented by fishing and a small amount of trade, gave way, in the 17th and 18th centuries, to a more market-oriented agriculture, with an increased emphasis on the production of barley for the export trade and the rearing of black cattle for the English market. The old odel system, which had guaranteed the independence of the small farmer, was gradually undermined by the legal and economic pressures of the new order, and many Arcadians found themselves reduced from the status of freeholders to that of tenants, dependent on the will of a landlord for their livelihood. The process was not as brutal as the Highland clearances of the 19th century, but it was a clearance nonetheless, a slow erosion of the ancient liberties that had been the pride of the Orkney Bondi. The population of the islands, which had grown steadily during the medieval period, began to stagnate, and emigration, particularly to the Hudson's Bay Company territories in Canada, became a feature of Arcadian life. The 18th century brought a new intellectual and cultural climate to Orkney, as the Scottish Enlightenment, with its emphasis on reason, improvement, and the study of the natural world, reached the islands through the universities of Aberdeen and Edinburgh. Arcadian scholars and clergymen, such as the minister George Lowe, who compiled an invaluable account of the island's natural history and folklore in the 1770s, began to study their own heritage with a critical and scientific eye. Lowe's Tour Through the Islands of Orkney and Shetland, published posthumously in 1879, is a foundational text for the modern study of Orkney, and it contains detailed descriptions of the archaeological sites, the folklore, and the way of life of the island's people. The same period saw the first systematic mapping of the islands, the building of roads and harbors, and the introduction of new agricultural techniques, all of which contributed to a sense that Orkney was emerging from the obscurity of its medieval past and taking its place in the modern world. The earldom was long gone, but the islands were not forgotten. They were being rediscovered, not as a Norse earldom, but as a unique and fascinating part of the British Isles, a place where the past was unusually present and where the visitor could step back in time. The 19th century was a period of profound transformation for Orkney, a time when the islands were drawn, willingly or not, into the mainstream of British social and economic life. The Napoleonic Wars, which raged from 1803 to 1815, brought a temporary economic boom to the islands, as the demand for Orkney's agricultural products and the strategic importance of Scapa Flow led to increased government spending and a surge in employment. The kelp industry, which involved the burning of seaweed to produce an alkaline ash used in the manufacture of glass and soap, flourished during the war years, providing a vital source of income for the coastal communities. The end of the war, however, brought a sharp economic contraction, as the kelp market collapsed and the wartime spending dried up, plunging many Arcadians into poverty. The response of the landlords and the government was, in many cases, to encourage emigration, and thousands of Arcadians left the islands in the mid-19th century for the colonies and the United States, seeking a better life in the vast expanses of the New World. The population of Orkney, which had peaked at around 32,000 in the 1830s, began a long decline that would last until the mid-20th century, a demographic wound that the islands have never fully healed. The agricultural system of Orkney underwent a radical transformation in the 19th century, driven by the same forces of improvement and enclosure that were remaking the rural landscape of Britain. The old runrig system, in which the arable land was divided into strips and allocated to different tenants each year, was replaced by enclosed farms, with consolidated fields and individual ownership or tenancy. The new system was more efficient and productive, but it also exacerbated social inequality, as the smaller tenants who could not afford to enclose their land were squeezed out and forced to become landless laborers or to leave the islands altogether. The introduction of new crops, such as turnips and potatoes, and the improvement of livestock breeds, particularly the Orkney sheep and the Aberdeen Angus cattle, boosted the island's agricultural output and tied the local economy more closely to the markets of the south. The coming of the steamship in the 1830s revolutionized Orkney's connections to the mainland, reducing the journey time from Edinburgh from several days to a matter of hours and making it possible for the islands to export fresh produce to the growing cities of industrial Britain. The isolation that had defined Orkney for centuries was, at last, being broken down, and the islands were becoming part of the modern world. The Victorian era also witnessed a surge of interest in Orkney's Viking past, spurred by the romantic nationalism of the age and the growth of archaeology as a scientific discipline. The Orkneyinga Saga, which had been first translated into English in the 1870s, became a popular text, and its tales of Jarls and battles captured the Victorian imagination. Antiquarians such as Sir Henry Dryden and George Petrie conducted the first systematic surveys of Orkney's medieval churches and castles, recording the ruins before they were lost to time and the elements. The excavations at Skara, Brae, the Neolithic village on the Bay of Skyle, which was uncovered by a storm in 1850, electrified the archaeological world and put Orkney at the forefront of the study of prehistoric Britain. The Viking monuments, however, remained largely unexcavated, their secrets buried beneath the green fields, awaiting the spades of a later generation. The Victorian visitors, who came to Orkney in increasing numbers, were drawn not only by the antiquities but by the wild beauty of the landscape, the sense of stepping into a world that was older, stranger, and more authentic than the industrial civilization they had left behind. The islands became a destination for artists, writers, and tourists, and the beginnings of the modern tourist industry, which is now a mainstay of the Orkney economy, were laid in this period. The religious landscape of Orkney in the 19th century was marked by the ferment of the Scottish church disputes and the rise of new religious movements. The disruption of 1843, which split the Church of Scotland over the issue of lay patronage, had a profound impact on the islands, leading to the establishment of the Free Church of Scotland, which attracted a significant portion of the Orkney population. The Free Church, with its strict Calvinist theology and its emphasis on the independence of the congregation from state control, resonated with the Arcadians' deep-seated sense of independence and their suspicion of outside authority. The growth of the Baptist, Methodist, and Plymouth Brethren movements added further diversity to the religious landscape, creating a competitive spiritual marketplace that was quite different from the monolithic establishment of the old Catholic diocese. The churches became the centers of a vibrant community life, organizing schools, charities, and social events that bound the people together and provided a bulwark against the isolation and hardship of island life. The religious culture of Orkney, with its distinctive blend of Presbyterian orthodoxy and local custom, was one of the defining features of the island's identity in the 19th century. The technological revolution of the late 19th and early 20th centuries reached Orkney in the form of the telegraph, the telephone, and most dramatically, the construction of Scapa Flow as a major naval base. The decision of the Admiralty to station the Grand Fleet at Scapa Flow during the First World War transformed the islands overnight. The quiet anchorages that had sheltered the longships of the Norse Jarls became the base for the most powerful naval force the world had ever seen, a fleet of dreadnought battleships, cruisers, and destroyers that stretched across the horizon. The influx of over 10,000 sailors and construction workers brought prosperity, excitement, and a degree of social disruption to the islands, as the Arcadians found themselves hosting the young men of the British Navy, with all the cultural clashes and personal entanglements that ensued. The naval base, which remained in operation until 1956, was the largest single employer in the islands for 4 decades, and its closure was a devastating economic blow from which some communities have never fully recovered. The legacy of Scapa Flow is written into the landscape of Orkney, the massive concrete fortifications, the abandoned gun batteries, and beneath the cold waters of the flow, the wrecks of the German High Seas Fleet, scuttled by their own crews in 1919, a ghostly armada that lies in the deep as a memorial to the conflicts of the 20th century. The 20th century brought Orkney to the center of global events in a way that would have astonished the Norse Jarls who had once ruled these waters. The First World War, as we have noted, saw the transformation of Scapa Flow into the primary base of the British Grand Fleet, and the islands were alive with the bustle of war. The Second World War, which erupted in 1939, brought an even more dramatic and tragic chapter. On October 14, 1939, the German submarine U-47, under the command of Gunther Prien, navigated the treacherous currents of the Penland Firth and the eastern approaches to Scapa Flow, slipping past the sunken blockships and the anti-submarine nets that were supposed to protect the anchorage. The U-47 entered the flow itself, a feat of seamanship that was as audacious as any Viking raid, and fired a spread of torpedoes at the battleship HMS Royal Oak, which was lying at anchor. The Royal Oak, a veteran of the First World War, exploded and capsized within minutes, taking with her 834 officers and men, many of them young boys barely out of training. The wreck of the Royal Oak, now a designated war grave, still lies on the bottom of Scapa Flow, a somber monument to the sacrifice of those who died. The sinking of the Royal Oak sent a shockwave through Britain and forced the Admiralty to undertake a massive program of fortification to seal the eastern passages into the flow. The Churchill Barriers, a series of causeways linking mainland to the islands of Lamholm, Glimpsholm, Bury, and South Ronaldsay, were built by Italian prisoners of war, and they remain in use today, a permanent reminder of the war and a vital link in Orkney's transport network. The Italian prisoners who built the Churchill Barriers left their own remarkable legacy. Housed in a camp on the island of Lamholm, the prisoners, who were captured soldiers of the Italian army, constructed a small chapel out of 2 Nissen huts, using scrap metal, concrete, and whatever materials they could scrounge. The Italian chapel, as it is known today, is a masterpiece of folk art, its interior adorned with a painted altarpiece, wrought iron screens, and a facade that transforms the humble structure into a miniature basilica. The artist responsible, Domenico Chiacetti, a native of the Italian Alps, poured his heart into the work, and the chapel has become one of the most visited sites in Orkney, a symbol of reconciliation and the enduring power of beauty even in the midst of war. The Italian chapel is a fitting metaphor for the larger story of Orkney, a place where the harshness of the environment and the violence of history have been transmuted into something beautiful and enduring, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The post-war period brought new challenges to Orkney. The closure of the naval base at Scapa Flow in 1956 was a severe economic blow, eliminating thousands of jobs and forcing the islands to rethink their economic future. The response was a concerted effort to diversify the economy, with a focus on agriculture, fishing, tourism, and in recent decades, renewable energy. The Orkney Islands Council, established in 1975, became a powerful force for local development, investing in infrastructure, education, and cultural initiatives that have transformed the quality of life on the islands. The growth of the oil industry in the North Sea in the 1970s and 1980s brought a new wave of prosperity, with Orkney's strategic position making it a base for the supply vessels and helicopters that service the offshore platforms. The Flotta oil terminal, on the island of Flotta in Scapa Flow, became a major hub for the processing and transshipment of North Sea crude, providing well-paid jobs and a steady stream of revenue that helped to modernize the island's infrastructure. The oil boom, like the naval base before it, was a temporary bonanza, and its decline in the 1990s forced another round of economic adaptation. The growth of tourism has been one of the most significant economic developments of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. The designation of the heart of Neolithic Orkney as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1999, encompassing Skara Brae, the Ring of Brough, the Stones of Stenness, and Maeshowe, placed the islands on the international tourist map and attracted a growing number of visitors from around the world. The Viking heritage, which was once the preserve of scholars and antiquarians, became a major selling point, and the Orkneyinga Saga was repackaged for the tourist market. The Saga Trail, a driving and walking route that links the sites associated with the Jarls, was established, and visitors can now follow in the footsteps of Sigurd, Thorfinn, and Magnus, visiting the Brough of Birsay, the Egilsey Church, and the Cathedral of St. Magnus. The tourist industry has brought prosperity but also challenges. The pressure on archaeological sites, the demand for housing that pushes up prices for local people, and the seasonality of employment that makes it difficult to sustain a year-round economy. The Arcadians, with their characteristic pragmatism, have managed these challenges with a degree of success, balancing the need for economic development with the imperative of preserving the unique character of the islands. The cultural renaissance of Orkney in the late 20th century, driven by a renewed interest in the island's Norse heritage, has produced a vibrant artistic and literary scene. The Orkney Folklore Center, the Orkney Storytelling Festival, and the St. Magnus International Festival, founded in 1977 by the composer Sir Peter Maxwell Davies, have all contributed to a flowering of creativity that draws on the deep well of Orkney's history. Davies himself, who lived in Orkney for many years, composed a number of works inspired by the islands, including his opera, The Martyrdom of St. Magnus, which was first performed in the cathedral in 1977. The opera, a searing exploration of faith, violence, and the abuse of power, brought the story of Magnus to a global audience and cemented the saint's place in the modern cultural imagination. The writers, musicians, and artists of Orkney, many of them incomers who have fallen under the spell of the islands, have created a body of work that is both deeply rooted in the local soil and internationally resonant. The Orkney of the 21st century is a place that looks forward as well as backward, a dynamic community that is proud of its past but not imprisoned by it. The archaeological exploration of Orkney's Viking past has entered a new golden age in the 21st century, with a series of remarkable discoveries that have transformed our understanding of the earldom. The Brough of Dearness, a sea stack on the east coast of mainland that is accessible only by a steep and narrow path, was long thought to be the site of a Norse monastery, a community of Christian hermits who had settled on this remote and windswept rock. Excavations conducted by a team from the University of Cambridge beginning in 2009, however, revealed a far more complex picture: a large Norse longhouse, workshops, and evidence of metalworking that suggests the site was a chieftain's stronghold, perhaps even a minor Jarl's residence, rather than a monastic retreat. The discovery of a stone gaming board, imported pottery, and a silver hoard indicate that the inhabitants of Deerness were people of wealth and status, connected to the wider Norse world. The excavations at Deerness are ongoing, and each season brings new finds that add to the story of this extraordinary site. The work is slow and painstaking, conducted in the brief summer months when the wind is not too fierce and the rain is not too heavy, but the results are spectacular. The investigation of the Brough of Birsay has continued to yield important findings, particularly regarding the relationship between the Pictish and Norse periods. The use of advanced scientific techniques, such as radiocarbon dating with Bayesian statistical analysis, has allowed archaeologists to refine the chronology of the site and to establish a precise sequence of construction and occupation. The results confirm that the Pictish settlement was still occupied when the Norse arrived and that there was a period of overlap, perhaps of several generations, during which the two communities coexisted and interacted. The excavation of the Norse longhouse at Birsay, with its massive stone walls and its central hearth, has revealed the domestic arrangements of the Jarl's household, including the separate areas for cooking, sleeping, and craft production. The midden deposits, the garbage heaps that accumulated over centuries, have been a rich source of information about diet, health, and the exploitation of the environment, and the analysis of the animal bones, the fish remains, and the plant seeds has allowed a detailed reconstruction of the earldom's economy. The Brough of Birsay is now one of the most intensively studied Viking Age sites in the North Atlantic, and it stands as a model for the integration of archaeology, history, and environmental science. The discovery of the Orkney hood, a finely woven woolen garment found in a peat bog on the island of Stransay in 1975, is a rare example of preserved Viking Age textile, and it provides a tangible connection to the clothing and craftsmanship of the earldom period. The hood, which was radiocarbon dated to the 9th or 10th century, is made of a herringbone twill and is distinguished by a long, narrow tail that may have been used as a scarf or a belt. The survival of organic materials in the anaerobic conditions of the peat bog is a remarkable piece of luck, and the hood is now one of the treasures of the National Museum of Scotland. The hood has been the subject of extensive scientific analysis, including dye analysis that has revealed the use of madder and woad to produce red and blue colors, and microscopic examination of the fibers that has identified the breed of sheep from which the wool came. The Orkney hood is a reminder that the people of the earldom were not just warriors and sailors but also skilled craftsmen and women, producing textiles of high quality that were both functional and beautiful. The hood, with its simple elegance, speaks across the centuries of a world in which the rhythms of spinning, weaving, and sewing were as central to life as the rhythms of the sea. The exploration of the Orkney landscape using non-invasive techniques, such as aerial photography, LiDAR, light detection and ranging, and geophysical survey, has revealed hundreds of previously unknown archaeological sites, transforming our understanding of the density and distribution of Norse settlement. The LiDAR survey, which uses laser pulses to penetrate vegetation and create a detailed map of the ground surface, has been particularly effective in identifying the faint traces of longhouses, field systems, and boat naus that are invisible on the ground. The results of these surveys have shown that the Norse settlement was far more extensive than was previously thought, with farms and settlements in areas that were assumed to be uninhabited. The Boyne survey, conducted in 2016, covered over 200 square kilometers of the Orkney mainland and identified over 1,000 new archaeological features, many of them potentially of Norse date. The sheer scale of the survey data is overwhelming, and it will take years of ground truthing, excavation, and analysis to fully interpret the findings. What is already clear, however, is that the Norse transformed the Orkney landscape on a massive scale, and that the legacy of that transformation is still being uncovered. The archaeological work in Orkney is not just about the past, it is about the future. The islands are on the front line of climate change, and the rising sea levels, the increased storm surges, and the accelerated coastal erosion are threatening the archaeological sites that have survived for a millennium or more. The site of Skara, Brae, which was uncovered by a storm in 1850, is now protected by a sea wall, but the wall itself is under constant attack from the waves, and there are fears that the site, and many others like it, could be lost within the next 50 years. The Orkney Archaeological Trust, working with the University of the Highlands and Islands and Historic Environment Scotland, is engaged in a race against time to record and preserve as much of the island's heritage as possible. The excavation of the eroding sites, the digital recording of the structures, and the removal of artifacts to the safety of museums are all part of a desperate effort to save the physical remains of the earldom before they are reclaimed by the sea. The archaeology of Orkney is thus an enterprise of profound urgency, a battle against the elements that is being fought on the same shores where the Norsemen once beached their longships. The genetic legacy of the Orkney earldom is a story that is written in the very blood of the island's people, a biological record of the migrations, intermarriages, and population movements that have shaped the Arcadian gene pool over the last 1,000 years. The Orkney DNA Project, launched in the early 2000s by researchers from the University of Edinburgh and the Orkney College, has systematically sampled the DNA of Arcadians whose families have lived in the islands for multiple generations, and the results have revealed a fascinating and complex picture. The paternal lineages, traced through the Y chromosome, are overwhelmingly of Scandinavian origin, with the haplogroup R1a, which is characteristic of Norse populations, being present at a much higher frequency in Orkney than in Scotland or Ireland. This finding confirms the historical and archaeological evidence that the islands were settled by a predominantly male Norse population, who intermarried with the indigenous women. The maternal lineages, traced through mitochondrial DNA, show a much more diverse pattern, with a significant contribution from Pictish and Gaelic sources, indicating that the female ancestors of the modern Arcadians included women who were already living in the islands when the Norse arrived. The genetic evidence thus supports the narrative of a Norse takeover that involved a substantial male migration, followed by integration with the local female population. The genetic uniqueness of Orkney is also reflected in the distribution of rare genetic variants that are found at much higher frequencies in the islands than elsewhere. One such variant, a mutation in the LDL receptor gene that causes a form of familial hypercholesterolemia, is 10 times more common in Orkney than in the general Scottish population, and it can be traced back to a single ancestor who lived in the islands several hundred years ago. This phenomenon, known as the founder effect, is typical of isolated island populations, where a small number of founders contribute disproportionately to the gene pool of future generations. The founder effect is not unique to Orkney. It is also observed in Iceland, the Faroes, and other North Atlantic island communities that were settled by small groups of Norse and Celtic people. The genetic isolation of Orkney, however, has been less extreme than that of Iceland, because the islands have maintained a steady flow of immigration from Scotland and England over the centuries, diluting the original Norse gene pool but also introducing new genetic variation. The result is a population that is distinctively Arcadian, with a genetic profile that differs from both the Scottish mainland and the Scandinavian homelands. The genetic research has also shed light on the health and disease history of the Orkney population, with implications for modern medicine. The high frequency of certain genetic variants associated with autoimmune diseases, such as multiple sclerosis and type 1 diabetes, in the Orkney and Shetland populations has attracted the attention of medical researchers, who see the islands as a natural laboratory for studying the genetic and environmental factors that contribute to these conditions. The Orkney Complex Disease Study, ORCADES, conducted by the University of Edinburgh, has collected detailed medical and genetic data from thousands of Arcadian volunteers, and the findings have contributed to our understanding of the complex interplay between genes and environment in the development of chronic diseases. The study has also revealed a genetic signature of the Vikings that is associated with an elevated risk of certain cancers, a legacy of the Norse ancestors that is both a biological inheritance and a medical challenge. The Arcadians, who have been generous in their participation in this research, are contributing to a global enterprise that may one day lead to new treatments and preventive strategies for diseases that affect millions of people worldwide. The ethical dimensions of the genetic research in Orkney are a matter of ongoing discussion and debate. The collection of genetic data from a small, closely knit community raises concerns about privacy, consent, and the potential for stigmatization. The researchers involved in the Orkney studies have been careful to obtain informed consent from all participants, to anonymize the data, and to engage with the local community through public meetings, newsletters, and a transparent process of consultation. The success of this approach is evident in the high levels of participation and the enthusiasm of the Arcadians for the research, which they see as a way of contributing to scientific knowledge and of celebrating their unique heritage. The genetic story of Orkney, like the archaeological story, is a story of origins, identity, and belonging, and it speaks to the deep human desire to understand where we come from and who we are. The DNA of the Arcadians is a living archive, a record of the migrations and encounters that have shaped the islands, and its study is a continuation of the historical inquiry that began with the Orkneyinga Saga. The broader significance of the Orkney genetic studies extends beyond the islands themselves. The genetic data from Orkney and Shetland have been used, in combination with data from other parts of the British Isles and Scandinavia, to reconstruct the genomic history of the entire region, revealing the waves of migration that have swept across northern Europe since the last ice age. The Norse expansion, which is so vividly documented in the Orkneyinga Saga, is now visible in the genomes of the populations that were touched by it, from the Arcadians to the Icelanders to the people of the Danelaw in England. The genetic legacy of the earldom is, therefore, not a local curiosity but a piece of a much larger puzzle, a window into the demographic and evolutionary processes that have shaped the human species. The Orkney earldom, which was for centuries a remote and isolated power on the fringe of the known world, is now, through the power of science, at the center of a global story, a story of human movement, adaptation, and survival that continues to unfold. The modern Orkney economy is a fascinating blend of the traditional and the innovative, a testament to the resilience and adaptability of the Arcadian people. Agriculture remains the backbone of the islands, with the green fields of mainland and the outer isles supporting a thriving livestock sector. The Orkney beef, produced from cattle raised on the rich grass that is fertilized by the sea mists, is renowned for its quality, and is exported to markets across the United Kingdom and beyond. The Orkney lamb, with its distinctive flavor derived from the heather and seaweed that the sheep graze upon, is similarly prized by chefs and food enthusiasts. The dairy industry, centered on the production of Orkney cheese and the famous Orkney ice cream, has carved out a niche in the competitive market for premium food products. The agricultural sector has benefited from the island's membership in the European Union, which provided generous subsidies for farming in less favored areas, and the post-Brexit future, while uncertain, is being navigated with the same pragmatism that has always characterized Arcadian agriculture. The farmers of Orkney, who are the direct descendants of the Norse bondi, continue to work the land with a deep sense of stewardship and a commitment to sustainability. The fishing industry, which was the economic engine of the earldom in the Viking Age, remains a vital part of the Orkney economy, though it has undergone a dramatic transformation in the last 50 years. The traditional inshore fishery, conducted from small boats using creels and long lines, has been largely replaced by a modern fleet of trawlers and prawn boats that operate in the rich waters of the North Sea and the Atlantic. The main catches are whitefish, particularly cod and haddock, and shellfish, including the famous Orkney scallops and the langoustines that are exported to the markets of Spain and France. The processing plants in Kirkwall and Stromness provide employment for hundreds of workers, and the value of the fish landed in Orkney runs into the tens of millions of pounds annually. The fishing industry, like agriculture, faces the challenges of climate change, overfishing, and regulatory change, but the fishermen of Orkney, with their intimate knowledge of the seas and their fierce independence, are adapting to the new realities. The sea, which has always been the lifeblood of Orkney, continues to provide a livelihood for the people who live on its shores. The renewable energy sector is the newest and most dynamic element of the Orkney economy, and it has the potential to transform the islands into a global leader in the production of clean energy. Orkney is blessed with an abundance of wind, wave, and tidal energy, and the islands have been at the forefront of the development of marine renewable technology. The European Marine Energy Centre, EMEC, based in Stromness, was established in 2003 and is the world's leading test facility for wave and tidal energy devices. The waters around Orkney are now home to a growing array of experimental turbines, buoys, and underwater generators, which are harnessing the immense power of the tides that race through the Pentland Firth and the Fall of Warness. The development of the marine energy industry has brought high-skilled jobs, investment, and international attention to Orkney, and the islands have become a hub for a new generation of engineers, scientists, and entrepreneurs who are determined to combat climate change. The Orkney Islands Council has set an ambitious target of making the islands carbon neutral by 2030, and the progress toward that goal, through the installation of wind turbines, community-owned solar arrays, and the promotion of electric vehicles, has made Orkney a model for sustainable development. The creative industries and the knowledge economy are the other pillars of the modern Orkney economy, and they reflect the island's ability to attract and retain talented people from around the world. The St. Magnus International Festival, the Orkney Science Festival, and the Orkney International Storytelling Festival are annual events that draw visitors, performers, and speakers from across the globe, contributing to the island's cultural life and generating significant economic spin-offs. The rise of digital technology has made it possible for people to live in Orkney while working for companies and organizations based anywhere in the world, and the islands have become a haven for a small but growing community of digital nomads, writers, artists, and consultants who value the quality of life that Orkney offers. The connectivity of the islands, which was a problem in the early days of the internet, has been vastly improved by the installation of fiber optic cables, and the Orkney Broadband Project has brought high-speed internet to even the most remote communities. The knowledge economy, which depends on ideas and information rather than on physical resources, is well suited to a place like Orkney, where the natural environment stimulates creativity and the pace of life allows for deep thought. The future of the Orkney economy, like the future of the islands themselves, is bound up with the great challenges of the 21st century: climate change, demographic decline, and the need to build a sustainable and resilient society. The Arcadians, who have weathered the storms of 1,000 years of history, are well placed to meet these challenges, drawing on their deep reserves of community spirit, their tradition of innovation, and their enduring connection to the land and the sea. The earldom is long gone, but the values that sustained it, independence, courage, and a fierce attachment to the islands, are still alive in the Arcadian people. The economy of Orkney, like the earldom itself, is a work in progress, a constantly evolving response to the opportunities and threats of a changing world. The story of Orkney is not finished, and the next chapter, which is being written by the people who live and work in the islands today, promises to be as remarkable as any that have come before. The relationship between Orkney and the wider world has been shaped, from the earliest times, by the island's position at the crossroads of the North Atlantic. The Norse earldom was a product of that position, and its Jarls were masters of the sea lanes that connected Scandinavia to the British Isles and beyond. In the centuries that followed the earldom's absorption into Scotland, Orkney's strategic importance did not diminish, it merely changed its form. The islands became a vital link in the maritime networks of the British Empire, a coaling station, a naval base, and a staging post for the exploration of the Arctic and the New World. The Arcadian navigator and explorer John Brae, who charted the Northwest Passage and discovered the fate of the Franklin expedition, was a product of this maritime culture, a man who had learned his skills in the waters of the Pentland Firth and the Arctic ice. The island's contribution to the exploration of the polar regions, the whaling industry, and the Hudson's Bay Company, where many Arcadians served as traders and administrators, is a largely unsung chapter of imperial history, but it is one that is deeply woven into the fabric of Arcadian identity. The Orkney of the 20th and 21st centuries has continued to be a place of international connections and global reach. The naval base at Scapa Flow, as we have seen, brought the world to Orkney, and the experience of the two world wars created lasting bonds between the islands and the nations whose sailors served and died there. The German sailors who perished on the Royal Oak, the British sailors who manned the Grand Fleet, and the Italian prisoners who built the Churchill barriers all left their mark on the islands, and their memory is honored today. The annual ceremony at the Royal Oak Memorial, attended by the descendants of the crew and by the people of Orkney, is a moving testament to the enduring power of these connections. The Italian chapel, maintained by a trust that includes both Arcadians and the families of the Italian prisoners, is a living symbol of reconciliation and of the ability of ordinary people to transcend the divisions of war. Orkney, a place of peace and beauty, has been forged in part by the fires of conflict, and its history is a reminder that the most serene landscapes can conceal the most turbulent pasts. The cultural connections between Orkney and Scandinavia, which were severed by the Scottish takeover in the 15th century, have been revived in the modern era through the work of scholars, artists, and cultural organizations. The Orkney-Norway Friendship Association, founded in the 1960s, has fostered exchanges between the islands and the Norwegian communities that share a common heritage. The Street Magnus Festival has regularly featured Norwegian performers and composers, and the links between the Orkney Cathedral and the Nidaros Cathedral in Trondheim, the medieval seat of the archbishop who oversaw the Orkney diocese, have been strengthened by a formal twinning arrangement. The Orkneyinga Saga, which is a shared text of the Norse diaspora, is studied and celebrated in both Norway and Orkney, and the Saga Trail has attracted Norwegian tourists eager to walk in the footsteps of their ancestors. The revival of these connections is a form of cultural homecoming, a recognition that Orkney's identity, though firmly Scottish, is also part of a larger Norse world that stretches from the Baltic to the North Atlantic. The relationship between Orkney and Scotland has been a complex and sometimes fraught one, marked by the tension between the island's distinctive identity and the pull of the mainland. The Arcadians have always been fiercely protective of their unique heritage, and they have resisted attempts to assimilate them into a homogeneous Scottish culture. The Udal law, the Norse dialect, and the local customs were all expressions of this resistance, and they survived for centuries against the pressure of the Scottish legal and educational systems. In the modern era, the Orkney Islands Council has been a powerful advocate for the island's interests, negotiating directly with the Scottish and British governments on issues such as the management of oil revenues, the development of renewable energy, and the protection of the island's environment. The debate over Scottish independence, which intensified in the early 21st century, raised the question of Orkney's constitutional future, and the islands, which voted strongly against independence in the 2014 referendum, have asserted their right to a distinct voice in any future negotiations. The relationship between Orkney and Scotland is thus a living and evolving one, a negotiation between the local and the national that reflects the island's long history as a semi-autonomous polity. The place of Orkney in the global imagination is secure. The islands, with their extraordinary concentration of prehistoric and Norse monuments, their wild beauty, and their rich cultural traditions, have become a destination for travelers from all over the world. The Orkney experience, the wind in your face on the Brough of Birsay, the echoing silence of Maeshowe, the taste of fresh crab and the sound of the fiddle in a Kirkwall pub, is something that cannot be replicated elsewhere. The islands are a reminder of the deep past that lies beneath the surface of the modern world, a place where the layers of time are visible to the naked eye, and where the visitor can feel the presence of the generations who have gone before. The earldom of Orkney, that extraordinary experiment in maritime power and cultural fusion, is a story that resonates far beyond the shores of the archipelago. It is a story of human ambition, of the clash and mingling of cultures, of the struggle for power and the search for meaning in a world that was, for all its violence, also a world of beauty, faith, and enduring achievement. The legacy of the earldom is not just the stones and the sagas, it is the spirit of Orkney itself, a spirit that endures, defiant and indomitable, in the face of the North Sea wind. The preservation and interpretation of Orkney's Norse heritage is a task of immense importance and considerable difficulty, a task that engages the energies of the local community, the academic world, and the agencies of the state. The archaeological sites, as we have noted, are under constant threat from coastal erosion, and the race to record and protect them is a matter of the highest urgency. The Orkney Research Centre for Archaeology, ORCA, based in Kirkwall, is at the forefront of this effort, conducting excavations, surveys, and conservation work across the islands. The center's work at the Brough of Birsay, the Brough of Dearness, and the many eroding coastal sites is providing a wealth of new information about the earldom period, and the use of digital technology, including 3D photogrammetry and laser scanning, is creating a permanent record of the sites for future generations. The data from these projects is shared with the global research community, and Orkney has become a model for the integration of archaeology with public engagement and education. The interpretation of the Norse heritage for the visiting public is a delicate balancing act between the demands of entertainment and the responsibilities of historical accuracy. The tourist industry, which is a mainstay of the Orkney economy, markets the islands as a Viking paradise, and the visitors who come are often looking for a romantic and exciting experience that matches their preconceptions of the Viking Age. The challenge for the museums and heritage centers is to provide that experience without compromising the integrity of the historical record. The Orkney Museum, housed in the old Tankernes House in Kirkwall, does an admirable job of presenting the complex reality of the earldom, with displays that include the finds from the Skara boat burial, the runic inscriptions, and the everyday objects that bring the past to life. The Jarlshof site in Shetland, while outside Orkney, is a model of interpretative presentation, with a visitor center that expertly guides the visitor through the layers of occupation from the Neolithic to the Norse period. The Saga Trail, which links the sites associated with the Orkneyinga Saga, provides a narrative framework that helps the visitor to connect the places with the stories, and the interpretive panels at each site are carefully worded to convey the essential facts without oversimplifying the history. The role of the local community in preserving and interpreting the heritage is crucial. The Arcadians are, in a very real sense, the inheritors of the earldom, and their engagement with the past is not a passive one but an active and ongoing process of cultural creation. The community-led projects, such as the excavation of the Norse mill at Doonby and the restoration of the St. Magnus Church at Birsay, are expressions of a deep commitment to the island's history and a determination to ensure that the heritage is not just preserved by outside experts but is owned and celebrated by the people who live there. The storytelling tradition, which has kept the sagas alive for centuries, is still a vital part of Arcadian culture, and the annual storytelling festival attracts tellers and listeners from around the world. The children of Orkney learn the stories of the Jarls in their schools, and they visit the sites as part of their education, absorbing a sense of connection to the past that will stay with them for the rest of their lives. The heritage of the earldom is, therefore, not a static relic but a living tradition that is constantly being renewed and reinterpreted. The academic study of the Orkney earldom has been transformed in the last 50 years by the contributions of archaeologists, historians, linguists, and geneticists, working together in a multidisciplinary effort that has produced a richer and more nuanced understanding of the Norse period. The work of scholars such as William Thomson, author of the definitive History of Orkney, 1987, and Barbara Crawford, whose studies of the Norse earldoms of the North Atlantic are foundational texts, has established the framework for all subsequent research. The journal, Northern Studies, published in Edinburgh, has been a major forum for the publication of new findings, and the international conferences on the Viking Age, which are held regularly in Orkney, attract scholars from Scandinavia, North America, and beyond. The research is ongoing, and new discoveries, such as the recent identification of a Norse shipyard at the Bay of Scull, are constantly refining and challenging the established narratives. The academic enterprise is a vital complement to the work of the museums and the heritage centers, providing the rigorous scholarly foundation on which the public interpretation is built. The future of the Orkney earldom as a field of study and as a source of cultural inspiration is bright. The challenges are real: the erosion of the sites, the need for sustainable tourism, the difficulty of balancing preservation with economic development, but the will to meet them is strong. The Orkney Islands Council's commitment to the World Heritage Site and to the protection of the island's natural and cultural assets is a powerful statement of intent. The passion of the local community, the dedication of the archaeologists and historians, and the enduring allure of the Viking Age all combine to ensure that the story of Orkney's earldom will continue to be told, and that the islands will remain a place of pilgrimage for those who seek to understand the medieval Norse world. The earldom of Orkney, which was once a power that humbled kings, is now a kingdom of the mind, a realm of the imagination that is open to all who come, with open hearts and curious minds, to the shores where the longships first landed so long ago. The journey we have undertaken across the centuries of Orkney's history has traced the arc of a remarkable and often brutal story, from the first appearance of the Norse longships on the horizon to the quiet, almost imperceptible end of the earldom. We have walked the halls of the Jarls, heard the clash of swords in the sea battles, and read the runes that speak of love, grief, and adventure. We have witnessed the transformation of a Pictish archipelago into a Norse power center, a maritime mini-empire whose influence stretched from the Arctic Circle to the Irish Sea. We have followed the sagas as they recount the lives of Sigurd the Mighty, Thorfinn Skullsplitter, Sigurd the Stout, and the incomparable Thorfinn the Mighty, whose reign represented the zenith of the earldom's power and whose legacy is still etched into the landscape of the islands. We have considered the archaeological treasures, the boat burials, the longhouses, the silver hoards, that bring the world of the sagas to vivid life, and we have explored the genetic, linguistic, and cultural legacy that the Norse left behind, a legacy that endures in the blood, the speech, and the traditions of the modern Arcadian people. The story of Orkney is a story of the sea, of the winds and tides that shaped the lives of the islanders, and of the fierce independence that has always been the hallmark of the Arcadian spirit. The earldom of Orkney was, in the final analysis, a triumph of human will over geography and distance. A few thousand settlers, clinging to a cluster of windswept islands on the edge of the known world, built a state that rivaled the kingdoms of the mainland, a feat that was possible only because of their mastery of the sea and their ability to adapt to the cultures they encountered. The fusion of Norse, Pictish, and Gaelic traditions that created the unique Arcadian identity is a testament to the creative possibilities of the meeting of different peoples, even when that meeting was often violent and unequal. The Jarls, for all their cruelty and ambition, were also builders, lawgivers, and patrons of the arts, and their story, as preserved in the Orkneyinga Saga, is one of the great narratives of the medieval world. The saga, with its blend of history, myth, and literature, is a work that continues to inspire, and its characters, the cunning Einar, the doomed Magnus, the mighty Thorfinn, are as alive today as they were when the saga was first written down in the cold halls of 13th century Iceland. The legacy of the earldom is not just a matter of historical interest, it is a living force in the present. The people of Orkney, who are the custodians of this extraordinary heritage, are engaged in a constant conversation with their past, drawing strength and inspiration from the achievements of their ancestors while adapting to the challenges of the modern world. The islands are a place where the ancient and the cutting-edge coexist, where the ruins of a Neolithic village sit alongside the testbeds for the wave and tidal turbines of the future. The Arcadian commitment to sustainability, to community, and to the preservation of their unique identity is a direct inheritance from the earldom, and it is a model for how small, remote communities can thrive in a globalized world. The story of Orkney is a story of resilience, of the capacity of a people to endure and to adapt, to face the wind and the sea and to emerge stronger from the encounter. As we bring this documentary to a close, I want to thank you for joining me on this voyage through the blood-stained, saga-rich, and endlessly fascinating history of the Orkney earldom. If the stories of the Jarls, the battles, the ship burials, and the cultural fusion have moved you, please take a moment to support this channel. Hit the like button right now, it really helps us to keep producing the deep, researched history you love. Subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss a new episode of Stories of Our History. I would be thrilled to read your thoughts in the comments section below. Which Jarl or saga event captured your imagination the most? Do you have family roots in Orkney, or have you visited these incredible islands? Your engagement, your stories, and your curiosity make this community what it is. Share this video with a friend, a family member, or a history lover who needs to discover the forgotten empire of the North Atlantic. Every like, every subscription, every comment, and every share is a vote for honest, detailed, and compelling history, and I am deeply grateful for your support. I hope you enjoyed this content, and I'll see you in the next video.